Hello and welcome to day one of Foreign Policy's inaugural virtual climate summit. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of FP, and it's my pleasure to kick things off today, especially since we're here to discuss a topic that is important to all of us everywhere and is only going to get more urgent. Last week, US President Joe Biden convened an Earth Day summit in which many countries announced new and enhanced goals to reduce their emissions and therefore to better combat climate change. We're here today and tomorrow to discuss those goals, to figure out what kinds of financing needs countries in the developing world have, and how we can best harness renewable sources of energy so we can both meet those energy needs, but also reduce carbon emissions. And so to that end, over the next 3 hours today and the same on Wednesday, we'll hear from top government officials, industry leaders, and issue experts from around the world to discuss and debate viable cross-sector solutions to meet climate targets ahead of the UN summit in Glasgow at the end of the year. We're going to hear from the heads of state of Colombia, Iceland, Bangladesh, and many more top politicians, environmentalists, and corporate leaders. This is what we do at FP. We bring these stakeholders together. Of course, you can take a look at the full program on foreignpolicy.com/events. Now, before we begin, I just want to get some housekeeping notes out of the way. We have a global audience. We're so happy to welcome you here. You're watching us on our virtual event platform. If that's where you are, welcome to you, or on social media or on live stream. Wherever you are, we want to hear from you. So if you're on the virtual platform on foreignpolicy.com/events, remember, you can submit your questions via the question box below the video player on your screen. It's very easy. We'll try to include as many audience questions as possible during our live sessions. If you're joining us on social media, chime in on the conversation. Use the hashtag FP Climate Summit. Let's make sure this conversation is heard far and wide. Finally, this summit was made possible by our sponsors, which include the Embassy of Japan, the EU, the Nuclear Energy Institute, Chevron, RBC Capital Markets, TechMet, and BHP. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for helping us convene this vital conversation. And of course, a big thanks in advance to all of our speakers and moderators who are going to share their perspectives with us over the next couple of days. I can't wait for many of the exciting and interesting discussions we're going to have ahead. So let's get started. Right after last week's White House Climate Summit ended, I know many of you have been following that closely. On Friday, I was lucky to get the chance to speak at length with John Kerry, the president's special envoy on climate change. Kerry, as you all know, is a former Secretary of State who previously ran for president. But if there's one role he was really born for, it is this: fighting climate change. Over the past few weeks, he has traveled to China, India, Bangladesh, and the UAE as he continues to try and bring countries together in putting forward more ambitious targets to cut emissions. We had a frank and tough chat. I asked him if the targets announced last week were good enough. I asked him if the US would be able to cooperate with China on climate change, given their increasing competition and hostility in other arenas. And I asked him why world leaders would believe in the United States' leadership today, given that Trumpism could easily just be 4 more years away. Kerry's answers will surprise you and they will inform you, but I began our interview by asking him what his biggest takeaways were from President Biden's Earth Day summit. Take a listen to the discussion.
Well, from my perspective, it is the fact that about 55% of global GDP is now committed to pursue a path of emissions reductions that will keep the possibility of a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit in the rising of our temperature. Will keep that alive as a possibility. We had very significant commitments from Europe, from the United States, from Canada, from Japan. And now we have to build on that with the words that were spoken by other countries which have yet to make such a significant step in reductions.
Now, Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, has warned that even with the ambitious new goals countries are setting, the world, quote, remains on a path of dangerous levels of global warming. Demand for coal, for example, is going to rise by 4.5% this year. How do you respond to criticisms that governments are still not doing enough?
They're correct. They're not. China is 30% of the world's emissions. And Mother Nature doesn't measure whether it came from China or the US or Timbuktu. The fact is that it's the total of all those emissions that are affecting our climate. So we all have to contribute to the reduction. Even if the United States went to zero tomorrow, we'd still have a problem because 85% of the rest of the emissions come from the rest of the world. So this is truly a global challenge, and we're not yet global in our response.
Well, one of the things you've talked about, Secretary Kerry, is about a new tracing program with satellites measuring in real time the emissions footprint of corporations and countries. Tell us a bit more about how that works and how you could use that to enforce compliance.
Well, this is a system that Al Gore and a team of folks have been working on for some period of time, which is to connect a satellite structure that has the ability with modern day sensor to measure in real time the footprint, the climate, the CO2 footprint, the carbon footprint of a particular company or a particular building, certainly a particular country, a particular city. And that way, there's going to be much greater visibility, transparency, and accountability on what people are doing to step up. And that kind of accountability will drive popular demand and discontent with the absence of action to focus on those particular entities.
A question about the European Union. The EU has presented its climate deal to cut greenhouse emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. But there's been criticism in Europe that EU member nations, according to one European lawmaker, Michael Bloss, who says these countries have rushed through a weak climate law for the sake of a photo op with President Joe Biden. What do you make of that comment? And I guess, is there room to set more ambitious targets when world leaders convene again later this year in Glasgow?
Oh, absolutely. Of course there is. This is simply a down payment on a process that will continue every day between now and Glasgow. And President Biden has directed us, his diplomats, to be involved in ongoing conversations with countries around the world in order to try to raise the ambition as we go into Glasgow. There is room clearly for improvement among certain countries, and we want to work with them. We want to work in a constructive way with these countries. We're not seeking to be finger pointing and singling out. We hope people will accept uh, the sense of shared responsibility here to get the job done, even if there's a difference in what someone might be asked to do at this point in their development, to do nothing and not to have reductions, but to be growing at this point in time, or to be bringing additional coal-fired power plants on this time, will inevitably be a point of contention and a problem.
One of the sessions at the summit that just concluded was about mobilizing finances for developing countries so they can improve their resilience against climate change. I think Brazil, for example, asked for billions of dollars to curb deforestation of the Amazon. And the topic of financing, I know, has also come up on your recent visits to India and Bangladesh, for example, where both countries have long made the point that the countries most responsible for greenhouse gases should also do more to protect the developing world. So I guess my question is, who's going to pay for all of this?
Well, first of all, it is not inappropriate for people living in a less developed country to be upset that they are less than 1%, fractions of 1% of the emissions, but they are facing some of the greatest consequences of harm. I'd be upset. You'd be upset. Anybody would be. So the issue is what's fair here? Where is the equity? Where do we find the justice in this transitional effort? Uh, I think President Biden believes, I know President Biden believes very much that we, the more developed countries, the richer countries of the planet, do have a moral responsibility, which he talked about today, to try to help some of these other folks to be able to make the transition. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bonanza time, just handout time, and you don't have responsibilities to do things yourself. But the finance structure that President Biden has been putting together, both with a public funding component as well as the private sector component, is geared to try to share the responsibility of getting this done. The 4.16 trillion that 6 banks have put on the line for climate investment could be deployed to some of these countries for legitimate commercial power agreements and deals, where we also have blended finance, which helps to reduce the risk of that investment and attracts capital to those places. Now, that's something we're going to be engaged in. We have agreed to a partnership with India, with Prime Minister Modi, to try to help in the deployment of the 450 gigawatts of renewable, which he has pledged to try to build out over the course of the next 10 years. It's a very ambitious goal, and it's worth our trying to help India achieve that goal, because if it does, India will be in line with its 1.5 degree target. So we all have a vested interest in that. And I think there are other countries, obviously, around the world where wealthier countries can help make a difference. And I know many of them are. Europe writ large, Canada, UK, Japan, all of these countries are prepared to try to be helpful. But we do need cooperation from the emitting country. They've got to be willing to go after this. And if so, I believe we can make great progress.
On the American side of things, how much of the financing you need for green initiatives is tied to the $1.9 trillion infrastructure bill? And what happens if that doesn't pass?
Well, there are certainly things that President Biden has proposed in the context of infrastructure that of the bill that just are plain common sense infrastructure projects that will have an impact on our emissions, on climate. For instance, if you build out a smarter energy grid where you actually can send power produced in one part of the country, but you can send it to another part of the country, that advantages everybody. It can help reduce costs. It's a far more efficient way to distribute energy. And in the modern times of artificial intelligence and quantum computing and new technologies about transmission lines and so forth, this should be a cakewalk. We ought to be able to do this. The country that went to the moon and invented the internet and has come up with the vaccines and knows how to build and create, we clearly can do this. It's not a lack of capacity, it's a lack of political will. And the truth is, you know, in the infrastructure that you build out for this, it's not Democrat infrastructure or Republican infrastructure. American citizens, all of them, benefit from an effective energy grid which guarantees a good source of energy for their homes, for their workplaces, and it's less expensive as a result of the efficiencies that then get built into the system. It's long overdue for us. And it's shameful because actually other people have far more efficient provision of energy in some of their countries than we do. We need to get our act together.
You know, you used to be a politician, Secretary Kerry, and I'm curious, how do you make green initiatives more politically acceptable? And I say this because even today, the very talk of carbon taxes is instantly criticized on Fox News. How do you get around that and bring along a part of the country that often hears in the media that climate change isn't even a problem?
Well, I think that the vast proportion, I mean, the Americans, the majority of Americans clearly know that climate change is happening and they support doing things that are common sense. And I think President Biden is extremely skilled at cobbling together coalitions, bringing people to the table. He's working very hard at that now. He's been successful. And I think hopefully there will be, Republicans, both in the House and the Senate, who recognize that the bridge connecting their city to one side of the river to the other is not a Republican bridge or Democrat bridge. It doesn't have any ideology. It's a bridge. It's an American bridge. And it's one our folks need to be able to cross the road and get to work or get home and to live the kinds of lives we want to live in this country. Our grandparents and our parents built that out without hesitation. The great construction periods of the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, Dwight Eisenhower building America's great highway system. They built the America we're living in today. And we need to be willing to invest in the America that we want our grandchildren and our children to be able to live in the future. I think it's a matter of common sense, and I think Americans will want to do this.
So much of what you're trying to do and what the Biden administration is projecting, it seems to me, is a reset, a sense of American leadership on combating climate change. But I have to say that there are many leaders around the world that haven't forgotten the Trump era, and they know that Trump or Trumpism could be back in 4 years, and Washington could once again pull out of the Paris Agreement and other international agreements. You've been traveling the world so much this year and last year. How do you reassure leaders who worry about the extent of America's commitment? What do you say when they express fears about a return of Trumpism?
I point out two things, and I'll add one other that I don't point out, but I personally don't believe it will be possible for Trump to come back and Trumpism, because I think that the course that we're on is one that America is going to embrace and feel very good about. But there are two things that I do say to those leaders. One is, even while Donald Trump was in office over 4 years, and even while he pulled out of the Paris Agreement, the fact is that 37 governors in the United States and the District of Columbia stayed in the Paris Agreement. And those 37 governors and District of Columbia represent 80% of the population of our country. And they had renewable portfolio laws, which they executed, and they did. They implemented them, Republican and Democrat alike. And we reduced our emissions by about 21% during that period of time. And more than 1,000 mayors in America all stayed in the Paris Agreement, even while Trump was out. So I don't think the return of someone who denies facts, denies truth, denies evidence, denies science, I don't think that's going to move America now at this point. Secondly, and I think this is the far more powerful argument, when you have trillions of dollars that are being invested in these new technologies and moving into this new energy marketplace, that's going to be such a powerful job creator and such a powerful moneymaker that there'll be so much investment moving in that direction, which is why you have this $4.15 trillion that's set aside to go into climate investment. And it'll be more than that, I guarantee you. Many of those bank CEOs told me that that's sort of a floor for them. They're confident they'll do more, but they didn't want to announce anymore. So we're going to see the marketplace firmly setting a course for the new energy future, for the new products, and no politician could come along and pull people away from the good jobs, the good salaries, and the money being made. Not going to happen. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And you're seeing this market, this new market determination all over the world. We're not the only ones chasing the holy grail of storage or of hydrogen fuel that's green, or of carbon capture and storage that's affordable. A lot of people are going to be doing this for the simple reason that the science is telling smart people that we have to do this in order to avoid even worse consequences for our planet and much, much greater costs to our economies.
Let's talk about China. This administration has been fairly tough on Beijing. It's accused China of conducting a genocide against the Uyghurs. It's engaged Taiwan. It's reinvigorating the so-called Quad, a group of countries that includes the US, India, Australia, and Japan. But amid all of this, the Biden White House also really needs China as a partner in fighting climate change. How do you, Secretary Kerry, partition this one issue, climate change, from all the other arenas of competition?
Well, I think historically, Ravi, we've always been able as a country, and big nations, powerful nations that have differences, have always been able, almost always been able. Obviously, North Korea may be an exception for the moment. But usually we've been able to come together and be able to try to negotiate and resolve certain differences. An example of that is Ronald Reagan in the Soviet Union. He consistently called it the evil empire. He told them to tear down the wall. He was a great advocate for freedom and for democracy. And ultimately, he met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, and they came to an agreement that it really didn't make a lot of sense to have 50,000 warheads pointing at each other on a hair trigger and to be living with that day-to-day danger. And so at that moment in time, these two leaders turned things around. And we went from 55 or 50,000 warheads down to about 1,500 plus that we have today, and a safer world as a result. Richard Nixon in China originally, in the opening up during the 1970s. These are the things that make a difference. And right now, climate is enough of an imperative for all of our countries. China doesn't benefit by not having America as a partner in dealing with climate, and the United States doesn't benefit from not having China as a partner in climate. So we're just disciplined. We have differences on economic rules, on cyber. We have other differences of human rights, differences of geostrategic interest. But those differences do not have to get in the way of something that is as critical as dealing with climate. And China made that decision. When I was in China the other day, we negotiated, and we negotiated back and forth in good faith. We didn't have to insult each other or shout at each other. We had a serious, tough conversation, but we managed to find the place and the way to be able to agree and move forward. And I think that opens the door or window to other possibilities in those other arenas. My sense is the Chinese know that there is a benefit to both of us being able to resolve the climate crisis because our citizens are deeply affected by our failure to do so.
I know you have a long personal relationship with your Chinese counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, the climate envoy. Tell us what you know about him. What animates him?
He cares about this issue. Xie Zhenhua has been working on this issue for years. People who've been involved in these negotiations for those many years have great respect for him because he's been able to thread the needle between the ideological tug or the other differences and stay focused on the climate issue. He's a professional, he's well read, well studied, and I think President Xi and the Chinese leadership have great confidence in him. So he is a person who he was appointed an interlocutor after I'd been appointed, I think precisely because we did know each other and we have worked together and we've crisscrossed the world on this issue. And I think if you talk to anybody who has been part of the conferences of the United Nations over the years, they will express their respect for Xie Zhenhua.
My last question. If you were to set yourself a goal of feeling good about 2021 and how it's gone, and allow yourself a rum punch on a beach on December 31st, how would the year have gone for that to happen?
Well, we would have ended this scourge of COVID-19 in a way that, or at least gotten control over it. We're not going to end it per se, but we'd have gotten sufficient control over it that people have a feeling we're returning to a more normal, new normal life that is less interrupted by the precautions that we have to take. And I think it would be by knowing that in Glasgow, the world did set out on a path where we have a real shot and the best shot of holding the Earth's temperature to 1.5 degrees and of heading towards a future that is 2050 net zero. That all of that is achievable because the world came together in Glasgow to make it possible. I'll have plenty of rum on that one.
First, but of course, there's a lot of work to get done before we get to December 31st and we allow ourselves that glass of rum. That was John Kerry. You were listening to the President's Special Envoy on Climate Change. If you want to go over the interview again or quote it, there's a transcript up on our website, foreignpolicy.com, and it's leading the homepage right now. There are a few more excerpts in there that didn't make the video version you just saw, so do take a look. We have lots more ahead today. You've heard the US perspective. Up soon, you will hear from the Foreign Minister of Japan, the Climate Minister of Denmark, the head of the IEA, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a video message from Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. This is a global problem, and we have, in the attempt to bring you global solutions, guests from around the world. All of that is ahead. Remember, for the sessions that are live, we would love to take your questions. Type them into the question box on our virtual platform on foreignpolicy.com, and we'll bring your views into the conversation. To take you into the next session, I'd now like to bring in my good friend and colleague, Amelia Lester. Amelia is the executive editor at FP, and she has worked as a journalist on 3 continents. Amelia, welcome.
Hi, Ravi. Great to be here. That was really interesting that Secretary Kerry thinks that green energy is now above politics. I thought he seemed pretty hopeful about the momentum of green energy. Did his optimism surprise you?
It did surprise me a bit because, in speaking to so many other leaders around the world over the last few weeks, the one question we keep getting asked for us journalists here in the US is, okay, well, this is a new administration. They're coming back into the Paris Agreement. What happens afterwards? What if there's a return to the old ways of America trying to disengage itself, then what? So his basic point that the green marketplace is essentially unstoppable at this point, I thought that was very hopeful, and a very interesting thing that, as he said, is a couple of points that he presents to leaders all over the world when he meets them. So I hope it's convincing. Well, we have lots more ahead. Amelia, what do you have next for us?
I'm especially pleased about our next segment because it features two leading government officials from Japan, which is a country that's experiencing some quite unique and pressing climate challenges as, of course, an island country. But Japan has made some really ambitious new pledges during the Earth Day summit last week. And to learn more about Japan's climate priorities, we're first going to hear from Toshimitsu Motegi, who was appointed Minister for Foreign Affairs in September 2019. Previously, he was the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry and the Minister of State for Economic and Fiscal Policy and in charge of economic revitalization. So following his participation in President Biden's climate summit last week, Foreign Minister Motegi recorded a brief video message for us, which was talking about Japan's future climate goals. So let's take a listen.
アグラワル編集長、ご来賓の皆様、まずフォーリンポリシー誌が世界中で10万人以上の読者を持ち、長きにわたって外交分野での議論を牽引してきたことに敬意を表します。私の書棚にも、さらに思考の中にもフォーリンポリシー誌が並んでいます。気候変動は我々が想定した以上のスピードで進んでいます。脱炭素化を進めることは、未来に責任を持つ我々が一体となって解決すべき待ったなしの課題です。気候変動への対応は、もはや経済への制約ではなく、むしろ世界経済を成長させる原動力になり得ます。こうした思いで日本は2050年カーボンニュートラルを目指していきます。そして4月22日の気候サミットで日本は2030年度に温室効果ガスを2013年度から46% 削減することを目指し、さらに 50% の高みに向け挑戦を続けていくことを表明しました。これはこれまでの目標を7割以上引き上げるものであり、野心的な目標です。この実現は決して容易ではありませんが、目標の達成に向け取り組みを具体化、加速化していきます。また4月16日の日米首脳会談では、日米気候パートナーシップを立ち上げました。このパートナーシップは、インド太平洋諸国をはじめとする途上国の脱炭素化を日米が協力して支援していくという観点からも大きな意義があります。今後、日米両国で途上国の脱炭素移行と経済発展の両立を後押しし、先端技術の研究開発、国際的なルール作りを進め、グリーンな成長に貢献していきます。日本はこれまで官民合わせて年間 1.3 兆円、118億ドル規模の支援を行っており、緑の気候基金にも最大で総額30億ドルの拠出を表明しました。日本が誇る省エネ、水素、CCS などの世界最高水準の技術を活用し、世界の脱炭素移行と脆弱国が受けている気候変動の影響への対応、この両面で国際協力を推進します。そして日本は COP26、さらにその先に向けて米国をはじめとする各国や国際機関と協力しながら、パリ協定の目標である脱炭素社会の実現のため、引き続き主導的な役割を果たしていきます。ありがとうございました。
Thank you for that very insightful message from Foreign Minister Motegi. Next up, I'd like to introduce Keiichi Ono, the Ambassador for Global Issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The ambassador previously worked as Deputy Chief of Mission for Japan in Jakarta, Indonesia, from October 2017 to June 2020, and he joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1988. Now, as just mentioned, Japan made some new and ambitious pledges last week at the Biden summit. Prime Minister Suga announced that Japan aims to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 46% by 2030. That's an ambitious target, which is aligned with the long-term goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. We're now going to explore more about Japan's specific challenges and priorities, how Japan can help other countries with their decarbonization targets, and of course, the role of Japan's tech and innovation sector in making it all possible. So I'm pleased to now welcome Ambassador Keiichi Ono to the virtual stage.
Hello, good morning. Good afternoon, Amelia.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Ambassador. Tell us, what are the most unique and pressing challenges for Japan in the climate space?
Japan has unique and pressing challenges as an island country. There are not much space to construct big solar parks, no large wind farms in the land area to increase the use of renewable energy. In addition, Japan is not surrounded by shallow water and cannot build offshore wind farms like in Europe. Overcoming these difficulties, Japan will pursue its utmost efforts to move forward in its actions to tackle climate change. However, the biggest challenges today are not such topographical disadvantages, the delay in technological innovation or stagnation under the COVID-19 pandemic, but that the international community has not taken a united effort. From that perspective, it is very significant that the United States has rejoined the Paris Agreement and has regained leadership in the international community. This was shown in the Leaders' Summit on Climate last week. We really welcome the US is back in this area. In order to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 worldwide, it is necessary for each country to set an ambitious target and to take concrete actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As you stated, and also our Minister Motegi stated, Prime Minister Suga announced at the last week's climate summit meeting that Japan will aim to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 46% in fiscal year 2030 from its fiscal year 2013 levels, and that Japan will also continue strenuous efforts in its challenge to meet the lofty goal of cutting its emission by 50% in FY 2030. This announcement means that Japan will raise the target by more than 70% from the current one, as Minister stated. This is really ambitious, but aligned with carbon neutral goal by 2050. Though it certainly will not be an easy task, we will accelerate our deliberations toward identifying policy and measures for meeting these goals. Actions are necessary, not just targets. Japan has been reducing its emissions for 6 consecutive years since 2014 and has achieved a reduction of approximately 14% from its 2013 levels. This coming decade will be critical for achieving net zero emissions by 2050, and further efforts are required from the international community.
Tell us a little bit about Japan's role in helping developing economies, particularly those in the Pacific, reach these goals.
Thank you. Yes, we put emphasis on the importance of assistance to developing countries. In order to realize a decarbonized world, efforts by developed countries themselves would not be sufficient. We need to focus on the efforts of developing countries, including those in the Indo-Pacific. Japan is also promoting international cooperation, including support for those countries. As we make an effort towards the decarbonization of developing countries, we should bear in mind that there are multiple paths of transition toward decarbonization, depending on different circumstances. Therefore, the key issue here is how to promote realistic transitions in accordance with the actual situation of each country. In the same token, I should highlight that promotion transition finance is also important for making sure that no sectors are left behind. The expansion of such transition finance will serve as a catalyst for investment, which will not only promote the expansion of renewable energy and the acceleration of energy transitions, but will also increase employment and develop the economy. Japan, for its part, has provided public and private climate financing annually, amounting to about 1.3 trillion Japanese yen, or about 11.8 billion US dollars. We announced that we will make an additional contribution of up to US dollars 1.5 billion, totaling 3 billion US dollars to the Green Climate Fund. We will support the global transition to decarbonization and address the impact of climate change on vulnerable countries by utilizing Japan's leading technologies in areas such as energy efficiency, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage, CCS. Yeah, please, Melia. Please.
You mentioned carbon capture. I was curious about the role of technology and innovation in promoting renewable energy and getting to this target.
Innovation is the key to promoting climate actions. This is crucial. At the end of last year, Japan formulated the Green Growth Strategy and mobilized various measures such as a fund of 2 trillion Japanese yen, tax incentives, regulatory reform, and international collaborations. The driving force of innovation is the research and development by private companies. Toward the realization of our ambitious 2030 goal, we will take stimulus measures to encourage companies to invest. Also, the role of subnational governments is crucial for innovation. The national and subnational governments in Japan will work together to aim for achieving decarbonization in more than 100 subnational regions across the country by 2030. We will also work for the realization of innovation that will enhance production and secure sustainability in food, agriculture, and forestry sectors. Furthermore, Japan will advance the transition to a circular economy, thereby creating new industries and employment. We aim to not only realize innovation in Japan, but also make use of such innovation to contribute to the international community. We should do more than just cooperating to achieve innovation among developed countries. We should also transfer our technology to developing countries. For those countries, building a system, developing human resources will be the basis for achieving innovation. For example, Japan supported the establishment of the Pacific Climate Change Center, PCCC, through grant aid in Samoa. After the inauguration of the center, Japan has also dispatched experts and offered trainings to relevant ministries and agencies in the field of climate change in Oceania countries. These international contributions can effectively meet the needs in this area, I believe.
Ambassador, we have a question from one of our audience members, from Stevie Leonard Harrison in Indonesia from the World Bank Group. And Stevie asks, as we need to integrate climate issues in terms of national security in each country, we need to find ways to boost meaningful participation by young people. How can the Japanese government and governments around the world too help boost the participation of young people?
Thank you very much. A question from Indonesia. As Amelia stated, I lived in Indonesia until last year, so I'm very, very pleased to get a question from Indonesia, such a lovely country. The question is actually right to the point. Young people's participation is very important because we are now working for the next generation or next generations. We are now caring about the globe, planet, but that is not the planet for us today. That is a planet for the next generation. So I strongly expect the younger generation be interested in this issue and participate in the various activities. But also the point is, these generations, we don't need to worry about the participation of the young people now, because they are very active. They have already been participating in many events all over the world. In Japan, yes, the government recently organized the kind of the competition of the presentations from the young people as regards the climate change issues. Many participants, yes, applied for this event. I'm very, very pleased, but we don't need to worry about how many participants will come and how many people, students are interested in it. They are already there. So we should have a lot of expectation to the younger generations, but at the same time, these generations should work for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question, also from an audience member. This is from Brian R. White, who writes, what is the present capability of carbon capture and storage in Japan?
Thank you for the questions about the CCUS. This is actually a technology innovation, crucial technology for the coming decades, I believe, because we still, at some areas, we still need the fossil fuels, but we have to aim at the 2030 goal and 2050 net zero goal globally. In order to achieve that, we need the technology of innovation, innovative technologies. CCS is a good example. We have been conducting many kind of pilot projects in Japan and also in cooperation with other countries, including the United States. And we put the priority on the development of affordable, cheaper CCS technologies in order to actually implement this technology to the business world. Thank you.
Well, we've covered a number of topics here today. Japan's ambitious goals, how Japan might get there through innovative use of technology, the importance of cooperating and helping out other countries in the region in funding and in technology, and of course, the importance of young people to that process. Arigatou gozaimasu, Ambassador Kaiichi Ono.
Arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, now on to a very different part of the world. I'd like to introduce Dan Jansen, who is the Minister for Climate, Energy and Utilities in Denmark. He is the chair of the new IEA Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transition. A little bit about this commission. It was established in January of this year. It currently has 29 members and it brings together government leaders, ministers, and thinkers. Its work obviously comes at a critical moment in clean energy transitions and around the world. As countries are looking to advance and shift to clean energy, the success of these efforts are going to rest on enabling citizens to benefit from those opportunities and navigate the disruptions that will inevitably come with them. So this includes social and economic impacts, as well as issues of affordability and fairness. I'm really excited to dig into these topics in our upcoming interview. And in addition, Minister Jansen is the author of several books in Danish and English, which seems like a little bit of a show off. And these include Beyond Deniers and Believers, Toward a Map of the Politics of Climate Change in Global Environmental Change. And that is from 2015. So I'm going to be talking to the Minister about Denmark's climate policy, its goals, and more about what a people-centered clean energy transition might mean. But just before I do that, a quick reminder to our audience, please keep your questions coming via the Q&A box, which is below your video player, and do chime in on social media as well. The hashtag is #FP Climate Summit. And now a very warm hello to Minister Jansen, who's joining me all the way from Copenhagen. I'm in Washington, D.C. Welcome to our Climate Summit, Minister.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Well, let's begin with the Climate Leaders Summit, which was held here in Washington, D.C. last week. As you and your Prime Minister wrote in Foreign Policy in the lead up to the summit, climate policy is very much a geopolitical issue. Can you share some reflections on how you felt the international community went at the summit? Did it achieve the goals that you went into it hoping for?
Well, I do think that we need to applaud the commitments shown by, first and foremost, of course, the US. They have now re-entered the Paris Accord, which is a big step forward, but also the pledge to reduce emissions by between 50 and 52% in 2030. Also, the UK, Canada, Japan, and others pledged more ambitious NDCs at the summit. So that was, in that sense, a success. Also, the sheer number of big emitters participating in the summit, I think we need to applaud. Having said that, of course, I think we also all agree that next steps need to be more tangible. So one thing is, of course, to set targets and have pledges. Next step is to then actually show results.
Right. So speaking of results, I guess everyone's now looking towards the Glasgow conference in November. What will you be looking to get out of that meeting, and what will make it a success in your eyes?
Well, there's at least three things that we need to solve at the Glasgow meeting. One is that we need more ambitious NDCs from the countries, that is, more ambitious pledges for how much they will reduce their emissions. We are right now far from what we need to stay below a 1.5 increase in temperature. So we need especially the biggest emitters to say that they will be first and foremost carbon neutral in 2050, but also intermediate targets 2030 as the most obvious one needs to be more ambitious. The EU has pledged at least 55%. My own country, Denmark, has pledged 70%, and we hope that others will follow suit. The second very important thing is that we need more focus on financing. More specifically, this has to do with the fact that the rich countries of this world actually promised the developing world $100 billion a year from 2020 to 2025. Until now, we really haven't delivered on that. So we need to do better there. And the third is all the technical stuff. The Paris rulebook, we still haven't implemented that. There's still things that need to be agreed upon. It sounds technical and boring, but it's actually probably the bread and butter of international climate negotiations. If that's not dealt with, then I doubt very much that we will have a successful outcome.
Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by the rulebook.
We need to make sure, how do we actually measure emissions? how do we sanction countries that don't fulfill the criteria that's set up? What do we do with all the different allowances that's out there? How do we make a transformation from the rules in the Kyoto Protocol into the Paris Agreement? All of these things that are technical but extremely important, not at least if we want to secure the environmental integrity of the Paris Agreement.
We got an interesting question from an audience member here, and I'm going to apologize in advance for perhaps mispronouncing your name. It's from Kunfen Zhangmo in the US, who works with the Eco News Network. The state of our climate is a result of nature herself and living ecosystems. Direct destruction of flora and fauna and ubiquitous toxic pollution are the causes of ecological demise. Why is there so little discussion of these facts when talking about climate change? Or put another way, why is there this vast disconnect between nature at large and the reduction of fossil fuels?
That's a very good question. I have to say though that I think right now is probably a time where we have more reasons to optimism than maybe ever before, because I do think that we have more focus on not only climate change and the dangers of climate change and what to do about it, but also the interconnectedness of climate change, the biodiversity crisis, and the fact that we need a sustainable policy for our whole planet if we are to remedy the problems that we face. Now, why the interest and the public debates aren't even bigger probably has to do with the fact that, well, one, we're in the middle of a pandemic, a global crisis where most countries are struggling just to save the lives of their citizens. Two, I think also we need to be honest and say that there are still some structures in our global economy that really benefit fossil-driven technologies. We still have subsidies for fossils around the planet. And it's difficult for countries to say, okay, we need to move away from something that's been a source of income for us for decades. My own country, for instance, we've had to make a difficult decision because we've chosen to say that from 2050, we will put a stop to all extraction of oil and gas in the North Sea. An expensive decision for us, but nonetheless, we've chosen to do it because it's necessary for us to fight climate change.
We've talked a lot about the international community and how countries need to work together. You've alluded a little bit to Denmark's own climate policy, so let's talk a little bit about that. Firstly, energy. Today, more than 50% of Denmark's electrical grid is powered by wind and solar energy. I was really interested to learn that. By 2027, renewables are expected to meet 100% of Denmark's energy needs. Denmark also hopes to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So you write that you're confident that we can do it. Tell me why.
Well, I think one of the most important points here is that the green transformation is not a transformation that necessarily has to lead to the loss of competitiveness for companies, more inequality, lower living standards. Because if that was the case, then probably I would be a pessimist. But I think we've shown in all modesty in my own country that for a couple of decades now, we've gone through a green transformation. We're not done yet, of course, but we have gone quite a bit of the way. And we've done it in a way that actually creates jobs, creates more jobs than we lose. And it makes our society as a whole more competitive. So I think that what we'll see now is a global market that will move in that direction, where the incentives will be such that companies, countries, regions that are at the forefront of this transformation will benefit. And that is probably the primary reason why I'm optimistic. Combined with this, of course, is the fact that we are now seeing a technological development that is going very fast. So, for instance, we were the first country in the world to build an offshore wind farm back in 1991. At that time, it really was a very expensive way of creating energy. So a lot of economists were probably shaking their head. But because we did it and others followed, that technology has now developed so much that offshore wind can compete with coal and nuclear in price most places on the planet. This technology development will also happen, has happened already on solar, will happen, I'm sure, on other green technologies, just as we see development of CCS, power to X technology, we're moving towards a hydrogen-based economy. All of these things really gives hope, I think.
Well, we're going to definitely talk more about wind energy and Denmark's very innovative wind islands, but we do have some fantastic questions coming through. And this one, I think you're particularly well qualified to answer. It's from Jamshed Cooper from Dubai, who writes, how would you propose to convince oil-hungry countries that are making slow progress on establishing renewable energy infrastructure to A, accelerate their installation of renewable energy infrastructure, and B, wean off the dependence of oil at the same time?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that all countries face different challenges. And therefore, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Having said that, though, I do really believe that the fact that we're looking into an economy where more and more countries are pledging carbon neutrality in 2050 shows you that really the whole context of making business on a global market are changing. We can't really see, I think, in the future, any companies doing well if they're not a part of this transition. It's very difficult to imagine that you can compete on a global market if you're not sustainable, if you use too much energy, and if that energy is black as opposed to green. And I think that's probably the most important lesson. And then also look at some of the good examples that we have. I think most countries that has gone through a green transformation so far and that has deployed a lot of renewable energy has actually done it in a way that it creates more jobs than you lose. So just as with many other technology changes in our history, the new, more modern ways of doing things might be a little bit difficult to get there, but when you're there, you hardly ever look back and say, well, we were much better off 20 years ago with the technology we had then.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the wind islands. And in particular, you mentioned that Denmark built the world's first offshore wind farm in 1991, but now in another global first, you're building an artificial island in the North Sea that will eventually be capable of meeting all of the nation's electricity needs, a history making 10 million homes. How did you scale up so quickly on this? And tell me a little bit more about government's role in sort of facilitating and promoting that innovation.
Yes, well, we're hoping that this will move offshore wind into a new era. Until now, whenever an offshore wind farm is being established anywhere in the world, the way you do it is you have the wind turbines on the sea, and then you have a cable that connects it to a domestic shore. In the future, we want to move the wind turbines further out at sea, and instead of connecting them to the shore of the domestic country that they are connected to, we then connect the wind turbines to this island. The island is then connected to different countries. So we'll actually be exporting also green electricity to other European countries, because we are only a country of under 6 million people. So we don't need electricity enough for 10 million households. So this is a way for us to also exploit the wind opportunities in the North Sea for the benefit of other countries. So that's one reason. The second reason why we're doing this is that one of the problems with renewables often is, how do you store the energy? The energy and electricity is there when it's there, but what happens if you don't need it when it's there, or if the wind doesn't blow, even though it blows most of the time in the North Sea? Well, the answer is we need to store the energy in other energy forms. So a part of this project is also to combine it with technologies like electrolysis, so that you transform the energy into hydrogen, and then from hydrogen into fluids that you can use on planes or ships or heavy transport on our streets. So in that sense, we solve two problems. We manage to store energy, but we also get the energy, green energy, into parts of our energy system, especially transport system, where it's difficult to get there now.
I want to ask you about your role in the IEA, but we did get two really interesting audience questions about the same topic. One is from Patricia Sullivan, who's at New Mexico State University here in the US, and one is from Peter McCarty, also in the US at the American Institute for Cancer Research. They both concern the role of agriculture in the management of carbon. I'm going to read Peter's question. Do you think increasing plant-based diet and nutrition in the global daily food consumption will increase carbon sequestration and decrease energy and water consumption?
Yes, there's no doubt that more plant-based food and more plant-based diets will be good for our health, I think in most countries in the world. But it will also be very important in the fight against the climate change, since putting protein via corn into a cow and then into a steak and then eating it really isn't a very efficient way of using energy. And then, of course, there's all of the problems connected with the methane and the different sources of greenhouse gases in the agricultural sector. So that is a part of the solution. We do also have to remember, though, that even if we do that, even if in a country like Denmark, where we eat a lot of meat, as you do in the US, even if we cut that down substantially, we're still looking at a future where we will be 10 billion people on the planet in 2050, probably, approximately. And a larger part of the population on the planet will be middle class as opposed to poor today, which is a good thing. But this tells us that we will see growth in the demand for protein, also probably animal protein. So it's not enough that the places of the planet where you eat a lot of meat now, you cut down on that. That's a good thing, and we need to do it. But we probably also need, or rather, we definitely also need to make the production of animal protein, that is meat, and milk and eggs, more carbon efficient. And we need to make sure that the way we produce food in general is more sustainable, because the way it works today is definitely not on the right track.
Let's wrap up with talking about Denmark's experiences with a people-centered transition, or a just transition, as I think it might be called there. The work of the International Energy Agency Commission that you're chairing is clearly part of this. What does it mean to ensure a people-centered transition, and how can countries with maybe less affluence or resources available to them ensure that this happens in their countries too?
I think it's absolutely essential that we make the transition a people-centered one, because first of all, I don't think we will get the public support that is needed for big transformations like this if it doesn't happen. Also, it wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't be justified if we made a transition that only benefited the rich part of the population in the countries of the planet. We need to use this also as an opportunity to make a world where no one is left behind. Now, this becomes very concrete when we talk about creating new jobs, because I'm very confident that the green transformation will create more jobs than we will lose in the fossil sector. But having said that, you also need to accept the fact that it's not necessarily the same people that will get these new jobs, and that's a problem. So we have 7 million people, for instance, on the planet that works in the coal industry today. How do we make sure that they then get a new job when we close down coal mines? Because they can't necessarily find a new job in offshore wind, for instance. So we're trying to collect the best examples from across the planet of how you can actually do this. This is about training, reschooling the workforce, working closely with unions. It's about investment in this in different sectors where you can actually use the same workforce. It's about investing in parts of countries, regions that are affected. In Denmark, our own example is the North Sea, where we are now moving away from fossil fuels and extraction of oil and gas, thousands of people employed in that sector, and trying to create new jobs for these people, both in CCS. That's a perfect example, because it's the same people working with the same machines, even sometimes on the same platforms, putting the carbon back into the ground that used to make a living taking the carbon out of the ground. And I think that we need more examples of that, and we need governments willing to support this development. That's why I was also very happy to see how President Biden put that at the center of his argumentation at the summit last week. Good, well-paid union jobs, he said several times in his speech, and I really think that's important.
I can't resist asking you a related question, and I promise this is the last one, but from Todd Lockhart here in the US with Rotary International. This is a question that I think a lot of people here in the US might be asking about Denmark's experience, which is, how much political pushback have you had regarding clean energy initiatives? How politically difficult was it to push through the initiatives that you've been talking about?
Well, we have a great momentum right now. So I would say that probably for the last 30, 40 years, it's been a topic that's been contested, and we've had political struggles. Nonetheless, we've had a common interest in making us independent of fossil fuel from other parts of the world, especially the Middle East. So that started back with the oil crisis in the 1970s. So that put us some part of the way. That didn't really have much to do with fighting climate change. It was primarily an issue about energy security. Last couple of decades, climate has been at the center of that discussion, but we've had conflict on it. My own party has been more ambitious than probably the right wing of our parliament, but I have to be honest and also give credit to a broad majority in the Danish parliament now and say that basically more or less all parties in Denmark now supports this transformation. And I think the reason why that has happened is first and foremost an acknowledgement that this is a global crisis, and really, if we don't fight climate change, then it doesn't really matter what we do on other policy issues, because that will hit us very hard. And we feel an obligation because we are in a position to actually be front runners on this issue, and we can maybe inspire other countries and develop technology that other countries can use. So there's a wide acknowledgement that gives us an obligation in Denmark to do it. Also, we see this as a good opportunity for our country. Most companies see it as a business opportunity. We have a partly state-owned company. It used to be Danish oil and natural gas exploitation company. Now it's the most sustainable energy company in the world, called Ørsted. It's a good example, and it's worth much more than it was before. So that's a good example of how you can make money, create jobs, and help other countries in the world also at the same time.
Well, you've given us a really positive glimpse into the future here with the idea of the wind island, and also Denmark's idea of a just transition to a clean energy future. Thank you so much for your time today, Minister Jansen.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce our next session moderator, Maria Korsnick. Maria is the CEO of from the University of Maryland. Drawing on her engineering background, her hands-on experience in reactor operations, and a deep knowledge of energy policy and regulatory issues, Maria aims to increase understanding of nuclear energy's economic and environmental benefits amongst policymakers and the public. We know that nuclear energy is often a controversial topic, but many experts argue that renewables alone may not be sufficient to transition us fast enough to the clean energy future that we so urgently need. So in this upcoming segment, we're going to hear from Maria and her guests about the importance of nuclear energy to help decarbonize the energy supply. And we're also going to hear about how it can help supply emerging economies with energy security as well. So let's learn more about the role of nuclear energy, the challenges facing the adoption of nuclear, safety issues, public acceptance, and viability of other alternative energy technologies. Welcome, Maria. Glad to have you here this morning.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for such a kind introduction. And thank you also to Foreign Policy for convening this exciting and timely event. The decarbonization goals set by governments worldwide are ambitious steps forward to addressing the global climate crisis. We know that any effort to decarbonize the grid while ensuring affordability and creating good paying jobs means nuclear energy will be a core part of the solution. In the United States, nuclear provides 20% of the total electricity and over half of our country's carbon-free electricity. And the US nuclear fleet is the world's largest source of firm, clean generation. Technologies such as small modular reactors, microreactors, and other advanced designs will make nuclear even more efficient, even more affordable, and even more versatile. I'm so very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Fadi Birol. Dr. Birol serves as Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. He's a critical voice in the international conversation on climate and energy. And Dr. Birol, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for your invitation. Very nice to be able to discuss these issues with you and with your colleagues. Thank you.
Well, let's get started. Dr. Birol, just last week, you participated in the Biden administration's climate summit. What are your reflections on what this moment in the climate conversation means? And how do you view the steps that the Biden administration has taken so far?
I think the meeting in itself was, in my view, a historical meeting, bringing so many heads of states together under the motto of how we can fight climate change. And I was very impressed with so many leaders making commitments how their countries will reduce their emissions. Why this meeting was historical? First of all, I think it was good to see several countries coming with new and more ambitious pledges. I can mention, for example, just remembering Japan is one of them, Canada, Brazil. China made a statement in terms of coal, several other countries, Australia, and European Union. Just the day before the summit, they put their climate targets in terms of a law in Europe, and also UK came up with a very ambitious plan. The second thing, which was important in my view, while different heads of states take the climate change as a major priority area for their energy policies, they came up with different solutions based on the country's energy sector, based on their political priorities and economic development levels. So this is the second thing. And the third thing, which is important, is the United States was able to boost the international momentum in addressing the climate change. I was happily surprised, because I didn't know much about the agenda, that the almost entire US administration was around the table, not only the President Biden, but also the Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Commerce. Many of them were there, showing that this is not only a one departmental issue. It requires across the governments to take it as a key priority. And I was very, very impressed, to be honest with you. But of course, as I tried to say in the meeting, there is a widening gap between the rhetoric and what is happening in the real life. Only a few days ago, we have published our numbers showing that despite all these commitments, growing interest and for many governments to address the climate change, this year, global emissions will increase substantially, second largest increase in the history. So this widening gap is something that we all need to take into account when we all, I hope, want to reach our net zero emission goals by mid-century. So perhaps it is the only point I wanted to mention here. And as I tried to mention to the heads of states on last week, this what is happening in the real life and what the political commitments are, there is a important difference there.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate your reflection that the Biden administration is really approaching this as a whole of government approach. There is a need to pair renewables with a firm, dispatchable source of energy to build that strong energy system of the future. What does that system look like in its end state?
So, first of all, when we look at the numbers, what we do at the IET is our job. I see that we need all clean energy technologies if we want to reach our climate goals. This is number one. Number two, in fact, climate change is essentially an energy challenge because more than 80% of the emissions come from the energy sector. So we have to find the solutions here in the energy sector. On 18th of May, only a few weeks from now, we are going to publish a roadmap for the global energy sector, what needs to be done to reach the net zero 2050. Yes, countries come up with pledges and so on, but globally, which technologies and how it can be reached, those climate targets. And I will like to tell you that at the IEA, we believe every country, every government, every citizens, the population, they have to make their own choices. But in my view, we do not have the luxury to exclude any clean energy technologies if you are serious to address the climate change. So when we look at the next 30 years, we have 30 years, especially the next 10 years is critical. What do we need? We need to halve the emissions. When we look at the next 10 years, we have to make the most out of the existing proven clean energy technologies. But this alone is not enough to reach the 2050 targets. Our numbers show that with the existing technologies, we can reduce the half of the emissions. The other half need to come from technologies which are not in the market today. They are in the laboratories, demonstration phases, and so on. So, to go a bit on the detail, what are the existing proven technologies we have in hand today to reduce the emissions? One, renewables, solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, bioenergy. These are, in most cases, they are economically viable, and they will be, I believe, the cornerstone of our fight against climate change. The second one, energy efficiency, using energy in a much more efficient way. So there is a huge room there, including United States, but not only in different parts of the world, including Asia. Huge room for having the same comfort level, using the, again, energy, but in a more efficient way. Third, electric cars, for example, they are becoming an important part, slowly but surely in some countries, but in general, a strong increase of electric cars. And in my view, nuclear power. Nuclear power is today, especially in many advanced economies, they are a significant part of the electricity generation in United States, in Canada, in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. And nuclear power and the safe and sound use of nuclear power they are all part of the existing clean energy technologies. But when we look at the future, we need other technologies. These are not enough. What do we need? In my view, we need hydrogen. We need carbon capture and storage. Many other technologies are needed to make use of the next 10 years, focus on the making the most out of the existing clean energy technologies, but at the same time, push the button for innovation for the next clean energy technologies. And I believe nuclear is a part of it. And having said that, there is no, in the energy world, unfortunately, there is not, as far as I know, one technology which is just perfect. All of them has, unfortunately, difficulty, limitations, need to be taken care of. One of them is more expensive. The other one is just in the premature way. The other has geopolitical implications. The other one is, as you mentioned, renewables. We have currently the issue of the intermittency. So we have to think in a systemic way how we can have a configuration of the clean energy technologies and reduce the emissions and have a secure energy system. I tried to mention in my speech in the Leaders Summit, we shouldn't forget the aspect of energy security as well. Yes, climate change is a key and perhaps a most important challenge of the day, but energy security is something we need to pay attention. And here, when we talk about electricity security, I think a combination of the renewable technologies with the batteries, with storage, but also in the countries where it is accepted to have nuclear power could be a good combination.
Thank you. One thing I'm interested in your thoughts on, as you have that vision of sort of everybody needs to play their part in this clean energy grid of the future. You know, nuclear provides great value to our energy system. Much of the conversation on energy really focuses on cost. How should we balance and how should we consider the cost conversation versus the value conversation?
I think the cost issue is not only for nuclear, but all energy sources, clean energy sources. The contribution they make to addressing the climate change and securing the energy system need to be valued. There should be a value system that you have to remunerate those contributions. It can be in terms of a carbon price, it can be in terms of an incentive or whatever. The climate change issue is such a critical issue. And this is, when you look at the numbers, countries' preoccupations, it is much more complicated than sending tweets left and right. You have to look at the entire system. You have to prepare, give energy, provide energy to citizens, to economy, but at the same time to make it clean. Therefore, in my view, the task is such a Herculean task today that it cannot be alone left to the markets. There is a need for governments. You mentioned the cost. If you look at the cost alone, this may not reflect some of the technologies that providing contribution to address the climate change and to secure our energy systems. Therefore, there is a need for regulation. There is a need for government support for those clean energy technologies that are making this type of support.
Of course, the global efforts to decarbonize will have to extend beyond just the electricity sector. As important as the electricity sector is, it accounts for only about a third of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Do you see a role for nuclear energy in the production of industrial heat, for clean transport of fuels, or other non-electric applications?
So when we look at where the emissions come from, the power sector is, of course, very important, but also we have the for example, iron, steel, major cement, aluminum, petrochemicals, especially those sectors where you need higher temperature in order to process certain goods and services. And here, today's game, it is fossil fuels. And especially coal in Asia is a major issue. When I told you that in the year 2021, this year, global emissions are increasing in a spectacular way, the main driver is coal, and coal in Asia. So in addition to, of course, other fossil fuels, oil and gas, nuclear can, together with other technologies, such as carbon capture and storage and others, can play a role here in the context of hydrogen. But of course, cost is a key issue here. The economics is a key issue here. And once again, we need governments to play a role and provide the right incentives for these solutions. The one confusion I see in the political debate, some people think we are talking about the clean electricity transition. No, it is clean energy transition. So we have to look at the emissions coming from the power sector or iron, steel, or the aviation. It is the same emissions. They are not the emissions from power sector is not more dangerous, 1 ton of CO2, than it is coming from the iron, steel. It is the same impact on the atmosphere. So we have to have a systemic approach to all of them. And in my view, again, I see it rather risky that we may think we have the luxury to make use of the technologies we like, we favor, and forget the others. And we feel that if everything is clean energy X, if I like this clean energy X, I feel much better. But the issue is not to boost our egos, but to reduce the emissions. If we are serious about this, I think we have to look at all clean energy technologies across the spectrum.
Sites. I know as we're looking at advanced nuclear, for example, it will operate at higher temperatures than what we have today. And that high temperature steam, as you mentioned, in and of itself is an important commodity. The fact is that the nuclear plants can also produce hydrogen. It's also, an interesting commodity for the future. So we obviously look very forward to seeing how much nuclear can help decarbonize, if you will, the entire sector. As you know, we've had successive administrations here in the United States that have held very different views on climate. Yet the clear trend in the US electricity industry has been towards decarbonization. Do you think we've reached the point where industry around the world will embrace the need to decarbonize regardless of political leadership, or is political leadership still an imperative?
First of all, I should say, at the IEA and me as head of the IEA, we have the same arm length to all clean energy technologies. It is, we look at what it brings, what it adds, what is the contribution, what are the challenges. Now, if and I am representing the governments here, and but leave this aside, when I look at the magnitude of the challenge and the time we have, I would very much like to say that the governments are today in the driving seat to address the climate change. We are seeing several companies, industry, coming one after another with pledges, with commitments. These are all very good and exemplary, many of them. But, I have to say but here, an industry or a company's main objective is the rule of the game, to make money. This is why you have the industries in many cases. So governments need to provide incentives, regulations, frameworks, so that the decisions are the industry's decisions in terms of investment, in terms of new ones, in terms of closing the old ones, should be driven by the financial incentives for the clean one, and disincentives for the dirty one. We were just talking about electric cars a few minutes ago. I can tell you that I give you a very, in my view, eye-opening number. We are happy to see electric cars growing, but if you look at last year, of all the cars sold in the world, 3% was electric cars, and 42% was SUVs. So 42% SUVs, 3% electric cars. And if you don't give an incentive to electric cars or a disincentive for SUVs, whatever people say when they hear speeches, nice speeches like we talk here, nice slides and television advertisement, they think, green is good. But when they go to buy a car, they choose the SUV because it's more comfortable for them, for many reasons, or more prestigious, if you do not give a price signal. Therefore, industry's commitments are good, citizens' preferences are good, but these have to be put on a solid ground by the governments to channel the industries and the citizens to make the right decisions. This is what I believe.
Thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question, going through some of the audience questions. This is from New Mexico State University, and it's a question about the emerging hydrogen economy. Can you share your thoughts on technology gaps to advance the mainstream use of hydrogen? And perhaps where do you see the future in terms of the different colors of hydrogen? There's green, there's blue, there's pink.
So I am working on the energy issues for some years, and I have rarely seen any technology which is so much loved by all the governments around the world. Hydrogen, everybody loves hydrogen. This is very good, but we need to see two things from the governments. First, a clear strategy for how they are going to develop the infrastructure of hydrogen in their countries. And the other one is the financial incentives. And this is most of them will be in connection with the renewables, clean, as you call it, some call it green. But we can also make use of hydrogen by using, as the Danish minister was talking a few minutes ago, in the context of with the carbon capture and storage being a part of the equation. Hydrogen is, we have high expectations from hydrogen, but once again, in the absence of strong government strategy, planning, incentives, with the rhetoric, it will not go through. I would also finish by saying one thing. I mean, we talk about different energy issues. There is one perception that as an energy person bothers me a lot. People think energy is creating problem for climate change. Energy is the main responsible sector for climate change. We have to make it clear. Energy is a good thing. Energy makes our life more comfortable, more productive. It brings economies, it brings life, light to develop different parts of the world. The problem is with the emissions. Energy is good, emissions are bad. So we have to put it in our mind, in my view, that we should use energy in a clean way, which will make our lives better, more productive, and much more modern, but reduce the emissions as soon as possible and in a drastic way. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fadi, for your time today and your really very valuable insights into this critical moment as we shape our global climate and energy future. And now I'll be joined by two leading experts in energy whose work is shaping the clean energy system of the future. Actually, one of our panelists, Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Minister of State in the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the United Kingdom, I believe has been called to Parliament. So I'm not sure that she's going to be able to join us here today. We also have Dr. Melissa Lott. She is a senior research scholar and the director of research at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Lott leads the Power Sector and Renewables Research Initiative. And Dr. Lott, it's so nice to see you again.
Maria, it's great to see you as well. And I will enjoy this one-on-one chat with you. I don't often have the chance for this one-on-one conversation, so I'm sure we'll enjoy it.
Well, you know, as we work towards the global clean energy transition, there's a broad understanding and acknowledgement that while renewables will play a much larger role, they aren't going to get us to an affordable, reliable, net zero system. You really need the partnership between wind, solar, hydro, and firm dispatchable sources like nuclear to be the key to unlocking this decarbonization challenge. Questions do remain about how we get there and how do we support the development of the next generation of nuclear technologies and the deployment of new reactors worldwide. So we'll be diving into those questions. So Dr. Lott, we have heard a lot in our previous segment here about sort of a global view. And how do you see that governments need to really think about the energy mix of the future, and specifically how renewables and other carbon-free sources need to complement each other?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most important things that we need to see in our policies is acknowledgement of where the end goal is. So if the end goal is 100% zero carbon electricity, we see very clearly in the analysis and the research and the evidence base that we have that if we want to have an affordable transition that doesn't leave communities behind around the world, that we need to think about three broad technology buckets. So three types of technologies. And within each one of these buckets, there are many specific technologies, but it's about their characteristics that we really care about. So of those three buckets, the first are variable renewables. So wind and solar fall into this as examples. And these resources, when they are around, when they are producing electricity, are extremely cheap. We've seen those cost curves come down. They are extremely valuable resources for keeping the overall cost of the transition down, but they're not 100% of a solution. If we try to just rely on that first bucket, things get very expensive very quickly. So we bring in the second bucket, which is energy storage. And a lot of times when I speak about energy storage, people think about batteries, and that is certainly one of the technologies we're talking about. But I think it draws on your last questions with Fatih, Maria, talking about what do we do with seasonal storage? How do we bridge gaps over long periods of time where the wind and sun are weak for weeks at a time and resources go down on those variable renewables? Well, it's batteries, but it's also energy storage that bridges seasons, like hydrogen, like some types of, I call them water batteries, but pumped hydro storage and other things. We've made a lot of progress over particular batteries over the last decade, but we have a long way to go when it comes to seasonal storage technologies. And this is part of why we're seeing the reemergence of the hydrogen conversation. The third bucket are these firm dispatchable power plants. So nuclear falls into this category. So does carbon capture with carbon capture, nuclear power plants with carbon capture and sequestration. So it's things that can provide us with power whenever we need it, and are always there. So when the variable renewables and the batteries and other types of storage can't get us through a gap, they make sure that our lights stay on and that we stay healthy and safe in our homes, which is really the key. We don't about electrons per se, we care that they're there to keep us safe and healthy and to keep our businesses running. And so we really need to ask ourselves questions about how we can structure our policies, our regulations, and our markets to keep that end goal in mind, recognizing that we need a diversity of technologies that have all these different types of characteristics, and that eliminating any one of those three buckets, it's like a three-legged stool. When you knock out a leg, it becomes very wobbly, which means very expensive and or unreliable. So we need to set up our policies in a technology neutral way that acknowledges this and lets them all be brought into the mix. And then on our market side, we need to make sure that these technologies can get paid, and many times for new types of relationships. So you may have been a technology that provided baseload power, and that's what you did. And now you're going to shift your role a bit. And we want you to shift your role and still be in the mix. We need to make sure that you can stay financially viable in the system.
So I really like your picture there of that three-legged stool. That's a nice item to think through. So we've heard about the opportunities for that clean, dispatchable leg of that stool, nuclear being one. And how do you create those opportunities with the other carbon-free sources for the future? Like, what are some of the mechanisms that you think would be helpful to create that sort of grid of the future?
Yeah, so of course, if we had our ideal pick of things and we went with, to step back and talked about the academic analysis and research, we would have a clear kind of carbon price or carbon restriction in the future, and we would design everything around that. Reality is a bit messier, than the plans we might put in place. And so when we look into the future, I think step one is making sure that we don't fall into the trap of what I term technology tribalism, where we say, you know what, I love this technology, but nothing else. So I'm going to support this one thing. We have to realize that each one of these technologies and technology types has a role to play. It's extremely valuable. The answer is and. I want variable renewables and energy storage and firm dispatchable power. Also, in the policies and how they're structured, and there's many designs that we can take, whether it's carbon taxes, cap and trade, clean electricity standards, there's a bunch that we can all, get behind in different ways, and that have trade-offs. Everyone has trade-offs. But what we have to say is this a system that is going to allow a variety of technologies into the system? Because we're talking about reducing emissions by gigatons, not tons, not a couple of pounds. These are huge solutions that we need. We need them rapidly. And so the question is, how can I make sure that I'm encouraging the next generation of technologies to come into the system while also keeping the zero carbon resources that I have? It's the whole saying, when you're in a hole, you don't keep digging deeper, you figure out how to get out of the hole. And so how do we keep zero carbon electricity that's already in the system there as we bring in the next generation of technologies and as we build out the variable renewables that we have, but we need a lot more of?
That's great, and I like your concept, if you will, around tribalism. I think that's very true. And when you talk about this different policy solutions that could help encourage this, I think one thing we also have to be careful about is in the pursuit of goodness, in the pursuit of trying to help, and in some cases, states do that with incentives, or even at the federal level, we do that with incentives, but we sort of play into that tribalism a little bit, right? We'll do an incentive on a specific kind of technology. And that can also sort of warp the playing field a bit where, yep, maybe that particular technology is encouraged, but if it's also disadvantaging another carbon-free source and pushing it out of the market, I'll go back to your analogy. It's a bit like digging that hole deeper. So you think you're doing good by increasing a lot of wind and solar, but if in doing that, you're pushing nuclear out of the market, it's not really a win. I know here in the United States, there's 4 nuclear plants in Illinois that are at risk of closing this year. And the state of Illinois is having that conversation right now in terms of if there's some way that they can sort of adjust the market so that those plants are sort of fairly treated. But if those 4 plants shut down this year, it will be equivalent to the clean energy that all of the wind and solar that we built across the entire United States in 2019 provides. So going back to your, we're digging a deeper hole, just those 4 plants are equivalent to all of the wind and solar from 2019. So I guess, can you speak a little bit about being thoughtful, if you will, as we put these policies in place?
Yes, I mean, there's so many things to consider. And this is one of those situations where, 10 years ago, we were in a different place when it came to the cost of variable renewables, in particular wind, solar and batteries as well, but I'll focus on wind. And so we put a bunch of tax incentives and credits in place, and we do this across the energy system in many different ways. So this is not just a renewables type of conversation. But at the time, our goal was to support a technology that wasn't quite there yet, and that we realized would be valuable in the system. So we wanted to pull those things into the system by giving a demand pull, by saying, you know what, hey, we want these systems, we're going to give you an incentive to do that. Now, I'll say, as someone who's worked in this field for well over 10 years, certainly I remember many years before those conversations were happening, we're in a fundamentally different place. We're talking about how do we get to zero and how do we do it extremely quickly. 10 years might seem like a good amount of time from now until 2030, 2035. That might seem like a lot of time, but in terms of energy infrastructure and power infrastructure, it's a blink in time. It's just a moment. It's not long at all, because those systems take a lot of time to develop, to get the people in place to build out those systems. So when we're thinking through what might have made sense 10 years ago, that may not make sense, and in a lot of cases doesn't make sense as we're going to this new future where we're talking about getting to zero and getting there extremely rapidly in order to support economy-wide decarbonization. Because the research is so clear on this, that if we want to go to a zero carbon economy, the power sector is the backbone of it. You don't electrify everything. It's a great headline, but it's not what you see actually bearing out the numbers, but you electrify a lot. And so as you do that, you need to decarbonize the power that is supplying it. You need to rapidly grow it. Those two forces mean you sit there and say, what resources do we have today? How do we keep those online? And how do we build very, very quickly? And whether it's 9 years or 15 or even 20, that's, again, it's a blink in time. And so we need to really think about how do we structure incentives for the new future we're looking at, not the incremental steps we were looking at taking 10 years ago.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pull an audience question here from Olympia, Washington. The question is really talking about how low the cost of gas is. So even factoring in some social cost of carbon, and that varies in terms of what people imagine the social cost of carbon is, but factoring in some credit for that, today's market, natural gas is still very cheap and makes it less costly than nuclear for base load. What policies must be implemented to bring the relative cost of nuclear down?
So I think that the conversation we're having today is about how do you move to a zero carbon system. Natural gas has been fantastic. Cheap natural gas has been fantastic in getting our cumulative emissions down. So it's helped us to switch from coal to natural gas in many, many cases around the country. We still have coal in the mix in the United States, which is where I think this conversation is coming from, you said. But we still have some coal left in the system. Natural gas has helped us to get emissions down. But at the end of the day, natural gas still has emissions. And if we're talking about zero, if that's our goal, not a 50% reduction, 70% reduction, 80, we're talking about 100%. We're talking about getting to zero. That's one of those questions where you say, in that third technology bucket, it's natural gas with carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. So it's natural gas plus a technology that we're still developing. Nuclear is another firm dispatchable resource that has zero emissions. And so when we think about those conversations, I would point anyone who's interested in it to look at a study by UC Berkeley that came out last year about how do we get to a zero carbon power system by 2035. And effectively, one of the things they said is we can get to 90% reduction with existing technologies if we keep nuclear in the mix. So if we don't shut that down and keep our large hydro in the mix. But getting to zero is a push. It's a stretch and a reach. So we need to think about what innovation we need to invest in, what R&D, how do we get technologies from the lab bench into the system, producing electricity for us to get that last 10%, because every ton does matter. We won't get gigaton solutions, but we need to get to zero, not halfway there.
Yeah, that's well stated. As you look ahead to that integrated energy system where we have wind and solar and hydro and nuclear batteries all working together and integrated into this affordable, reliable, and carbon-free system, what barriers do you see that are our biggest challenge to getting there?
So if we talk about getting to zero, There's certainly a barrier when it comes to available technologies. At the same time, the biggest barriers in the pathways that we see going forward are soft things that aren't actually to do with technology per se. So how do we get infrastructure permitted and built and put in place? How do we get new technologies into the system? And so, as we look at going forward, we've got to think about things. So in the US, but we're not alone in this. Many countries in the world have acts that make permitting quite extensive and long process at times. So in the US, we've got National Environmental Protection Act that says, we're going to actually have to do reviews on big infrastructure projects that touch on, federal lands, on land in general. We've got to look at what it's going to do. And so those kind of processes need to be streamlined, or else in terms of the timescale we're talking about, we can't have a project in the permitting stage for 10 years if we need it to be running in 10 years because we haven't built it at that point. So looking at how we can speed up those processes and say, what do we need to accomplish and what are the soft barriers that are actually in our way?
Actually, you bring up a great point. This really isn't a US problem, right? It's a global challenge. We all have to decarbonize if we're going to win. And as you look around the globe, are you confident? Do you feel that we're creating the right conversations today with the different countries working together? And if not, what more do we need to do?
I think that the Leaders Summit that would just happen, in DC last week was a great first step. I think Glasgow will be very interesting to look at. At the end of the day, the nationally determined contributions, the statements, the goals that countries present are goals. They're not legally binding in that stage. So let's all acknowledge that, of course. They still need to be backed up by hard policies. But I'm encouraged by a lot of different trends that I see, some of which are spurred on by low costs of renewables, by different countries looking at new technologies they can bring into the system, the broader understanding of what we need to do to hit zero. This is a really unifying conversation where the conversation is not about, is it 70, 80, or 90%? It's zero across an economy. And that allows us to really focus in on what the evidence says about the pathways to get there. That's helping us in these conversations. But the reality is we are not there yet. We are not in a place where we have firm binding policies around the globe, or even most of the globe, that will force us into this place, that we will be on the pathway to get to a full zero carbon solution. So far, it's been fits and starts. So I'm encouraged, but I'm also cautious because I realize that, as we go forward, we need more than what we've had so far. So I will be watching the next COP meeting in Glasgow. I'm sure you will be as well, to see where those commitments come through and what different countries are doing. But in this conversation, because it's a global one, something we haven't highlighted is we're talking about going to zero carbon as countries develop, as we work to achieve our sustainable development goals, including universal access to clean power, to clean cooking around the world. So we're not looking to do this goal in a vacuum. We're looking to develop to improve quality of life around the world. And we need to acknowledge those different priorities in this mix. So it's not even about how we get to zero carbon, it's how we do it in an equitable and fair way that supports development and supports healthier futures for all of us. The good news is going to zero and also reducing air pollution, which is a big threat to human health around the world, killing millions of people each year. The solutions are actually largely the same because the energy system is both a predominant source of human-produced carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but also key types of air pollution that make us sick. So it's a good problem to be in, where actually the solutions are wins across many, many of these different priorities we have.
Well, great. Thank you. Let me just give you sort of one last opportunity. Is there anything that's on your mind that you didn't have an opportunity to share with us today that it's an important message and you want to leave us with?
I want to just leave us with a message that carries on from something that we just spoke about, which is goals are fantastic. Now we need to do the work to figure out what it will take to get those goals done in a practical, step-by-step manner. We're going to set these goals. We're going to have leadership, which is fantastic to see because we need the leadership in these conversations. Now the hard work is there as well. How do we get the steel on the ground? What is actually going to be part of the solution? And how do we create a playing field that is going to allow us to get to 100% solution and not just partway there? But thanks again, Maria. Enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lott, for your work and for the great discussion today. Now I'm very pleased to welcome back Amelia for the next discussion.
Hi, Maria. Thank you for that fascinating conversation on the role of nuclear. I wanted to shift the conversation now to an opportunity I had last week to sit down with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island to talk a little bit about President Biden's goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It was a really fascinating discussion because we got into the role of lobbyists in intervening in the progress and change that is possible in the Senate. We talked about his work reaching across the aisle to Republicans on getting change happening. And we also talked about his work as the co-founder of the Senate Climate Action Task Force. So Senator Whitehouse, who's a Democrat, stood at his desk on the Senate floor and delivered a speech about the threat of climate change and the urgent need to take action 279 times since 2012. He finally dropped the mic earlier this year, literally and figuratively. And so I spoke to him about what prompted his mic drop and where we go from here. So let's hear my full conversation with Senator Whitehouse. Hello, Senator Whitehouse. Thank you so much for joining us at the FP Virtual Climate Summit today.
I'm delighted to join you.
Let's get right into it. You famously spoke 279 times on the Senate floor about the need to wake up to the threat of climate change. This began in 2012 when the Senate refused to pass a House-passed climate bill, and it ended with what you called a mic drop at the dawn of the Biden administration. Why drop the mic now?
Because I have confidence in the Biden administration. I think that through choices in personnel, in policy, and frankly in passion, they have shown a real readiness to, at last, tackle the climate challenge.
And how can colleagues of yours, both Democrats and Republicans, who are maybe reluctant to vote for big, bold action on climate and energy, be persuaded of its importance?
Well, I think the persuasion is running ahead of the what I would call the political safe passage. There is not, except maybe Alabama, there's not a single state whose state university doesn't teach climate science. And all you have to do if you're a member of Congress is to go to your home state university, whether it's the University of Alaska or the University of Iowa or Florida State, pick your university and ask for a briefing on what's going on. And it's really, really obvious. So I don't think there's a whole lot of convincing that needs to be done. I think what needs to be done is to show a politically safe pathway for them to get involved in a major piece of legislation without suffering the retribution of the massive political apparatus of the fossil fuel industry, which has stood over this issue for a decade like a very fierce warden of inmate behavior.
You mentioned the idea of a safe political path forward. Can you give us your pitch maybe for those colleagues of yours that are trying to find that path on the issue of carbon pricing?
Well, that's really two questions in one. One is the pitch on carbon pricing, and the other is how do you find a political path forward? On the latter question, I think that a lot of our colleagues would find a political path forward if there were one. I think the problem is that there isn't one yet that they're comfortable with. And I think the fault for that lies with America's corporate community, which has taken little or no interest in climate in its dealings with Congress. You have companies that will have very good sustainability policies internally, that will talk a good game through their investor, public and consumer relations people. But when their lobbyists and their political apparatus comes to Congress, climate has fallen completely off of the wagon. And to focus the business community on Congress and getting their apparatus supportive of a climate bill is what will open the gate for a significant number of Republicans. but TechNet, which is the big trade group for the Silicon Valley giants, the Wall Street lobbying powers, the consumer products lobbying powers, big ag. You just don't see any effort by any of those big lobby groups. And until very recently, the big business lobbies like the US Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers were the worst obstructors of climate action. So you had businesses that had a statement about climate and a policy about climate that were supporting a political infrastructure that was directly opposing their stated policies. So we got to sort that mess out.
And why is that?
We'll give them safe passage.
Why that disconnect?
Why is that? Because they have other priorities. They have other priorities. They care about tax things. They care about competition things. They care about being able to bring in cheap foreign engineers. They care about a whole bunch of stuff, but climate has not climbed up the issues portfolio of their lobbying teams. And I think to a certain degree, it might very well be that CEOs actually don't really know what their own company's lobbying is. And I've urged CEOs to commission political audits of their own companies to see where they've been, to look at their lobbying, look at their electioneering, look at their trade associations, and have somebody independent tell them where they've been, because most of them are actually lobbying against the policies they claim to espouse. So that's a big mess.
So in your view, it's not necessarily about getting the CEOs on board. The CEOs you speak to are often already on board. It's that that message hasn't necessarily trickled down.
Correct.
To use a phrase.
They may be on board on the cocktail circuit. They may be on board when they sit down with fellow CEOs and have press conferences. They may be on board when they sit down with their sustainability officers. But when they send their massively powerful corporate political apparatus to go work on Congress, climate is not on their list.
So you mentioned that maybe your colleagues, it's less about political persuasion and more about finding a viable political path forward. How do we get this massive lobbying apparatus to find?
Well, my strategy has been to call it out. I've been very aggressively targeting the members of the US Chamber of Commerce and asking them to explain why the US Chamber of Commerce was outed as one of the worst climate obstructors in America when their policies would seem to be pointing in a different direction. And I've made enough noise about that, and several colleagues have joined me in making enough noise about that, that there's now a kind of corporate insurrection happening within the US Chamber of Commerce. We don't know how that's going to turn out, but they have moved from being dead opposed to everything to beginning to be nominally in favor of some things. And with any luck, you know, at the end of the day, they are supportive of climate legislation with the same vehemence and fervor that they opposed climate legislation for an uncontested decade. So we'll just have to see how that turns out. But I think a certain amount of naming and shaming and pointing out this discrepancy between what companies say and what they do in Congress is probably the best avenue.
It must frustrate you that you've been talking about this on the Senate floor since 2012, and it's only now that you're beginning to see that kind of real shift in the vocabulary and rhetoric of corporate America. Why do you think it took so long, and how can we speed it up?
Well, it has been extremely frustrating because it hasn't been the science that's been holding them back. That's been clear forever. It hasn't been the dire warnings about what's going to happen. That's been clear forever. It hasn't been, you know, calls for action from young people, from Pope Francis, from environmental organizations, from innumerable sides. It's really a little hard to understand exactly what it has been. I think it was simply that when corporations come to Congress, their very most selfish and self-interested personas are what appears. And it's the last place in the corporate world in which doing something good and doing something important actually works its way into corporate policy. I mean, it's hard to explain it any other way. They come with a point of view about Congress and a point of view about their priorities that just doesn't let climate come to the top of the list. Now that may change because some of these industries are starting to see that they have significant economic risk from climate change. And it's starting to move, but they're a long way from being on the good side. I would say that they've gone from being full on horrible to moving up the needle towards halfway. But if they actually forcibly come in and push for climate legislation with the same passion that they push for their other priorities, and let Mitch McConnell know that there won't be support if they're not getting their priorities met, those kind of things, then that changes quite quickly. But the political side of corporate engagement is kind of its nasty underbelly. So it's not surprising to me that they're nasty about actually doing anything on climate change. This just is not where they show their best face.
Senator, let's circle back to the issue of carbon pricing. In 2019, you introduced the American Opportunity Carbon Free Act, and you've spoken about carbon pricing as an essential move forward. To me, it seems like a very ambitious plan. Tell me why you think it's possible and how.
Carbon pricing has three attributes that are significant. The first attribute is that if you look aside from elected Republicans who are very much under the threat of the fossil fuel industry's political apparatus, to former Republican officials, Republican and libertarian-leaning think tanks, the Republican intellectual community, if you will, they almost all, when they come to a recommendation on climate change, come to the same recommendation, which is a border adjustable revenue neutral price on carbon. So if you're going to build bipartisanship, it makes sense to build it around an idea that has broad Republican intellectual support from economists and from a whole variety of former Treasury secretaries and so on. So that's attribute one. It is a potential avenue to bipartisanship when the political pathway clears through the fossil fuel industry's obstruction. The second is it works. It's a really big adjustment to the economy that needs to be done. The International Monetary Fund has calculated that in America alone, the fossil fuel industry stands on a subsidy every single year of $600 billion. It's really hard to affect economic behavior if you leave a $600 billion annual economic subsidy in place working for the fossil fuel industry. And a carbon price is really the only way to correct that. And the third thing is that a carbon price is exportable. If you want to solve a global problem and prevent free riders from cheating and not doing their share, a carbon price is a very easy measure to compare whether country X and country Y are pulling their weight. If you have to compare complicated regulatory schemes in different states, it's really hard to do that comparison. But if you've got country A and country B, and one has a $10 price on carbon emissions, the other has a $100 price on carbon emissions, you can make a pretty ready adjustment so that trade policy can protect the countries that are doing the right thing and induce and incent the cheating countries to quit cheating and step up like everybody else.
We've spoken a little bit about the mismatch in corporate America's rhetoric and then its lobbyist behavior and how that's been a roadblock to climate mitigation. I wanted to touch briefly on the idea of misinformation as another roadblock. We've obviously seen the dangers of science denialism during the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you see misinformation and the deliberate spread of information about climate change that maybe makes people less reluctant to act as a roadblock?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There has been a really persistent campaign of misinformation, I would say disinformation, by groups that front for the fossil fuel industry for a long time now. And people who study this very closely go back and say that it began when the fossil fuel industry picked up the tobacco industry's apparatus for denying the health effects of tobacco and pivoted it to climate change. And then it went on steroids after the Citizens United decision let unlimited amounts of money pour into politics. But there has been a massive, massive disinformation campaign. And it's one that I think probably has caused some risk of legal liability for some of the participants on grounds that what they were saying was fraudulent. They knew that it was not true when they were saying it, and they said untrue things in return for financial reward, which is the definition of fraud. And interestingly, the Department of Justice whacked the tobacco industry with exactly such a verdict back when the tobacco industry was behaving this way. So there's precedent there as well. But yes, disinformation, systematic propaganda and disinformation has been at the heart of the fossil fuel industry's denial operation.
You mentioned the Department of Justice's moves against the tobacco industry for spreading misinformation. What are some of the actions you'd like to see either on a legislative level or by other branches of government in Washington to fight this problem?
Well, I think we need to, look under the rocks and have people have a pretty good look at what has gone on. So you have a group that is a fossil fuel front group that sent 200,000 fake textbooks to teachers, middle school, high school teachers, science teachers all around the country. It costs a lot of money to mail 200,000 book-sized packages. It costs even more money to write a fake textbook and to get it printed. Somebody came up with the scheme for flooding teachers with fake textbooks and spent a lot of money to do that. And I think we should be asking questions about who that is. Now, of course, they will all fight very desperately to say that that's, unfair, that nobody should ever know who's behind these schemes. But I think it's really important for the American people, as we're thinking about how to deal with carbon pollution and carbon emissions, to understand that we are where we are because of a very deliberate, very sneaky, very expensive, very persistent campaign. And the more we can peel off the skin of that campaign and show who's behind it and how they were doing it, Americans love a good detective story. And this is a good detective story. It's got some real bad guys in it.
Just finally, Senator, what progress on climate change has been stymied either domestically or globally by the COVID-19 crisis? And are there maybe opportunities that come out of that crisis now that we've seen just how interconnected the world really is?
Actually, I can't really think of anything that has been stymied because it erupted under the Trump administration. We weren't going to make a lot of progress on climate anyway because they were completely in the pocket of the fossil fuel folks. And by the time Biden became president, he was already good to go on climate. So I don't see it stymieing much progress there. I do think that it may have stymied the corporate community in organizing itself to push for climate action because people were focused on all of the issues for major companies that the COVID pandemic raised. So it may have cost us some time in terms of the corporate community getting organized. I really don't know. But I do think it actually almost may have done some good in the sense that it truly established the proposition that you need to pay attention to science or there can be really dire, even deadly consequences. And that some things are big enough that they require really big government responses. And I think the aperture of government response was opened by COVID in a way that is, I think, a good example for climate, and the need to really, 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 really understand the science. I mean, science basically is the headlights for society, telling us what's coming at us. And we should no more drive policy forward at high speed without those headlights than we should drive at high speed down a road in the dark of night without headlights. You end up smashed up against a tree when you do that. And that's what we're risking right now with climate.
Right. Well, thank you for your thoughts and perspective on this, and for allowing us to end on a somewhat hopeful note there, on reminding everyone about the importance of science. Thanks so much for your time, Senator, and for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, again, that was Senator Whitehouse. I loved what he said about science as the headlights for society, a really important principle, I think, to keep in mind throughout this two-day summit. We thank the Senator for his contribution as well. Much more coming up today, including a truly fascinating conversation now hosted by my colleague, Andrew Solinger, who's the publisher of Foreign Policy. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Amelia. Thanks so much, and really enjoyed that discussion with the Senator, and couldn't agree more that science is our headlight, and that's a great segue into this discussion that we're about to have. So thank you for having that discussion, and really appreciate it. I really enjoyed what Melissa Lott mentioned earlier from Colombia. She talked about last week's climate summit and mentioned that goals are great, but now it's time for action. And in this session on harnessing AI solutions to save the planet, we're going to talk about how we can use technology and science to help take action. Recent developments in AI and big data offer vital tools to help us, and they can help officials make informed climate policy, prepare for climate impacts, build resilient efforts, and identify ways that the effects of climate change can be mitigated and perhaps even reversed. FP has convened some of the pioneers and innovators working at the intersection of climate science, machine learning, big data, and global climate policy to discuss new AI technologies and the ability to monitor forests and other land uses to produce complex climate modeling analysis that can offer crucial new insights in climate crisis, and how countries can utilize AI technologies to best adapt their policies for a changing planet. But before we get into our panel discussion, I'd like to share with you a fascinating talk I recently had with Topher White, who's the founder of Rainforest Connection. Rainforest Connection uses AI powered by old smartphones to help monitor illegal activity in rainforests. I spoke with Topher a few weeks ago before he set out on a trip back into the Brazilian rainforest, which is why he couldn't join us live today. And towards the end of the clip, he's going to share some actual audio from the rainforest. So listen for that. And we'll also see some in action high in the trees with one of our panelists who'll be joining us in a minute. So we can talk to her about that experience as well. Let's play it. Welcome, Topher.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Please tell us very quickly about Rainforest Connection and its mission.
So we are a nonprofit tech startup. We basically build technology and partnerships around the world to help fight deforestation, primarily focused on the idea that if we can tell the right people where the logging is and give them the resources to actually stop it, they will actually go and take responsibility for that. Our main technology involves listening devices that we put up in treetops in remote parts of the forest that are most threatened to listen to all the sounds of the forest, stream it into the sounds of logging trucks, gunshots, and then we can actually scramble people on the ground, like indigenous groups, NGOs, local communities, to actually go and confront the logging on the spot. We're doing this all over the world in 14 different countries. And in many cases, it does work. It kind of brings out the complexities of what happens on the ground in these areas, but it really sort of speaks to the fact that if we want to fight and confront climate change, we can't do it without protecting forests. And the only real way to do that is to work with people on the ground who have jurisdiction over these areas and who can actually take responsibility for stopping this activity.
That's fantastic, Topher. And we know that you are, one of the reasons that we're pre-taping this session is because you're about to leave on another trip, I believe, to Brazil. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now?
Certainly. Again, Brazil is one of our oldest long-term projects with an indigenous tribe called the Tembe up in North Brazil. It really kind of is a great example of the projects that we think can be most impactful. There's a thought that oftentimes when you're protecting environmental areas, that you're fighting illegal logging, that you're going to be working with police to do it. But in the vast majority of cases, it's actually local communities, indigenous groups, NGOs that take full responsibility for this in the absence of government support. And that's really the only way that we're going to make these very sort of remote places that are outside the sort of purview of a lot of law enforcement be better protected. But in order to do that, we have to show that we're supporting them. In this case, illegal logging is a large-scale black market activity throughout much of this area of the Tembe land in the state of Pará. And to your points, illegal logging, of course, is not the entire way that a forest gets degraded. And more than 15% of climate emissions, of carbon emissions that come out of deforestation come from the full destruction of the forest. But illegal logging is the gateway activity. It's so profitable to go in and take out a few high-value trees. That to do that, they'll actually cut a road all the way through the forest. And then sometimes those legal logging operations will move on, but the road remains, and that leads to smaller scale logging. It leads to illegal farms. It leads to sort of the burning of the forest overall. So if you can stop the illegal logging, you can stop the roads. If you can stop the roads, you can stop the wholesale destruction of the forest, which could be the fastest, cheapest way for us to fight climate change. And in many ways, the ones who can have the most impact are just single, small groups of individuals, indigenous groups in these areas who aren't doing it to fight climate change. They're doing it to protect their own backyard and their own heritage. But they may have more impact on fighting climate change than any dozens of us working on technology. So the best things that we can do sometimes are to build tech tools for them. I'm finding that can be repeated in many ways throughout the world, despite the sincere complexities and differences that you see from one region to the next. There's enough overlap that the tools can be built to help many different groups.
All right, that's fantastic. And we understand that you actually use old cell phones, which in and of themselves could use recycling time after they're upgraded in this bioacoustic project plan. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works?
It's true. So when we started this project several years ago, we thought, we'll build our own hardware. We'll build some complex device. And it turned out that old smartphones, the ones that already in 2012 were being thrown away, were actually fantastic little computers. They could already connect to the networks that exist around the world, in the forest in many cases. And they can run great software. And they're really powerful little computers. So we built these guardians, these rainforest guardians, we call them, using old Huawei smartphones. And it's, to this day, the vast majority of the devices that we have up around the world, it actually involves old smartphones. They've been working for 5-6 years. They're really great little computers. I mean, if they're going to build them for customers around the world, hundreds of millions at a time, they really are very reliable. And these devices have to work pretty hard. They're capturing all the sounds, compressing it, analyzing it, and sending it up to the cloud in real time for years and years at a time. We have devices that have been running for 4 years nonstop. So it's actually pretty impressive. And for a small startup, there's just no way that we could have built our own hardware originally to match that. These days, in order as we look for more functionality, we're sort of branching out into other kinds of hardware as well. But it's really important to point out that if you look around, like the technical detritus that we sort of take for granted, the phones that we cycle through every couple of years are still outrageously impressive pieces of technology. And we can either put them up in trees to act as sort of eyes and ears that people don't have, or we can recycle them and send them on to people in the field who may be a few more generations behind. But it's important that the people that are on those front lines in the forest have access to technology that's impressive enough to do what we needed to do.
So you're using upcycled cell phones to build fully connected, intelligent ecosystems across different rainforests. How are you using machine learning to support your work to analyze new sets of data from across these environments?
Well, as you say, the primary purpose of these guardians, these ones that use old smartphones up in trees, their primary purpose is to capture all the sound of these really vibrant soundscapes and actually send it up to the cloud in real time, kind of almost like a phone call, except it's using more advanced communication techniques. And once it gets there, that's where we can use the cloud, power of the cloud to actually look for anything that we're trying to find. And that's where AI really comes into it. So we're using machine learning and other sort of convolutional neural networks to pick out the sounds of threats primarily. So chainsaws, logging trucks, gunshots, which actually is harder than you might think in the very vibrant and noisy soundscape of the forest. And that's where machine learning became very, very important, because We used sort of non-machine learning techniques early on, but the forest was so noisy that you'd have lots and lots of false indications and alerts. And it's really, really important that you have a system as reliable, because we're dealing with so much data, and the partners themselves are not necessarily so ingrained in the technical elements of it all that you can't send them false alerts. If you're going to send someone off into the forest to confront loggers, you have to be absolutely sure that they know what they're going into, and that's actually a correct alert.
That's fascinating. So bioacoustics, in a sense, gives us an understanding of the Earth's ecology beyond what the human eye is capable of seeing and studying. This sounds like a really interesting new science, and really must sound fascinating.
Absolutely. It's really kind of the next generation, I would say, of ecological study. If you look at the way that the humans themselves perceive the world, obviously visuals are very, very important to us. But in the forest, you can't see more than a few meters in front of you. And so the way that animals express and assert themselves, sort of the way life asserts itself across the entire planet, is often with sound. And the way that they kind of struggle for dominance, the way that they communicate, the way they express doubt and emotion, all sort of comes across in the sound, and the way in which they interact with each other over great distances. But what's important for that is that we aren't really well primed to pick this out. And so also it takes place over long periods of time. You have to listen to the sound, which takes a year to listen to if it's a year of audio. But AI can analyze this stuff at scale. So the real power in which machine learning and AI has helped us in general across all technology particularly applies to bioacoustics, because not only are there many subtle things that humans themselves either cannot physically hear or sort of cognitively would not notice, AI can pick it out and also can deal with large amounts of sound at a time. And so the way in which animals sort of interact and sort of evolve and change, especially with climate change in front of us, is really going to be exposed by the way that AI can pull it out. And so I really think that we're heading into an era almost as significant as you mentioned the microscope, where that sort of exposed a world that no one really thought was in existence, no one thought was possible, but was teeming with life. In sort of applying AI and machine and sort of autonomous monitoring around the world of acoustics, I really think there's going to be entirely new worlds of acoustic or sort of a biological and ecological study that come out of the fact that AI can expose and seed hypotheses that we never knew were there.
So, not having spent a lot of time in rainforests myself, Topher, I do know that there's a tremendous amount of sounds coursing through the forest from all sorts of different sources, from the vegetation itself through to the animals that inhabit it. How on earth can you parse that and create some sense and data from what we're hearing?
And so the way in which we're able to sort of look at this is to say, look, we're not going to know exactly what we're looking for the first time. To do everything on the edge and do all of your analysis there on the device, you're sort of assuming that you know what it's there for the moment that you put it up. So a huge part of what we're doing is to use these networks to stream it all up into the cloud, so that, yes, you want to find threats. But what if you are able to also look for new species that no one's particularly expected to be there, tracking of endangered species, all sort of at once, all the way down to the second across years of audio. Imagine a resolution of being able to analyze bioacoustics for years at a time, but also zoom into the sub-second and find out what's happening there. So here's an example of another threat, another ecosystem also out of Sumatra, where in this case, there is a chainsaw in the background. So this triggers our alert. You can hear that humming at the bottom. But at the same time, there are at least a dozen species that are vocalizing over top of this, because they're going to go on living their life and adapt to it. So much of the way in which we look at these vibrant soundscapes is for the value that these different species bring to what's there, and understanding that you can use this audio stream to find threats, but you should also realize that nature itself is expressing itself in different ways. And this continues on for decades, for centuries of audio that we have in the system, which we intend to preserve for posterity, to be able to analyze the way these things change with climate change.
Thank you for transporting us to the rainforest for a few moments, and great to see your passion in listening to those sounds. And I couldn't even hear the chainsaw. I'm sure it was there. So it's very important work that you're doing. Thanks.
Of course. It's really great to be able to be a part of it.
So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time here. But before you go, I was hoping that you could introduce a clip that we have that we'd like to play of you actually installing one of these rainforest guardians high up in a redwood tree here in the US, but just to show how it works. And we're hoping that you could tee us up and explain exactly what's going on here.
Sure. So in these clips that you'll see, it's kind of pretty typical of the work we do out in the forest. I'm joined by Joy Tan of Huawei USA, showing her the way in which we climb high to the tops of treetops to put these guardians. And guardians, of course, are solar-powered devices for listening to what's happening there. But the higher you go up in trees, the better cell phone reception you get, many, many tens of kilometers and miles away from cell phone service. And the further away you can hear, and of course, the better protected they are from threats on the ground. So we climb to the top, in this case, of a redwood to install a device that's in an area where you can't get cell phone service on the ground, but you can get it at the top. And she was actually impressively good at climbing the tree. And hey, that's why we'll get her out to the rainforest next time.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's play it.
This is the Rainforest Connection Guardian device. It's more or less thing, but inside is a Huawei smartphone, an old Huawei smartphone from 2009, I think. And then we got these batteries and some circuitry to keep them powered. And essentially, this fits right under the tree. Snap this microphone on right there. What do you say? You want to snap it on?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There it is. We can open this up and confirm that this phone has service out here, which it does. It didn't on the ground, but we do up here at the top of the tree. Well positioned. And then get it right in there.
Okay.
We're gonna put the Guardian box right here. You can pull to tighten it up.
Well, how do you do this by yourself?
Oh, well, you know, you get used to it. But no, I mean, a lot of what we're trying to do is train the people there who are in the forest to be able to do this themselves. So now, check it out. You got these solar panels that can not only protect it from rain and moisture, but we got these microphones here underneath that can be protected from you know, the moisture and the rain that comes down. But sometimes even sunlight itself can be dangerous because the sun is so hot sometimes that you need something to kind of protect it. So that's what these solar panels are all about at the time. So yeah, that's how the design came up. Beyond that, I got to say it's a constant challenge to figure out how to protect something inside of a rainforest. It's a really bad place for electronics.
Love that clip. Thanks so much to Topher for sharing some of that experience in the rainforest and high in the redwoods with us. But let's get now into our live panel discussion. And I want to remind the audience we're live again. So please do ask questions in the box beneath the video player of our panelists. It'll make our conversation so much richer, and I'll field them and ask them as we progress. So let me introduce our panelists. Joining me are Abhilasha Purwar, Abby. She's founder and CEO of Blue Sky Analytics. Blue Sky is a climate tech startup using satellite data and AI to build environmental monitoring and climate risk assessment products. We're also joined by Janet Ranganathan, Vice President for Research, Data, and Innovation at the World Resource Institute. Janet leads WRI's efforts to harness the data revolution, combining open data, information technologies, AI, and human networks to drive more transparent and accountable management of the planet's resources. She established WRI's Data Lab and helps ensure WRI's family of data watches provide trusted and actionable information. Look forward to talking about data with Janet. And finally, our tree climber, Joy Tan, Senior VP of Public Affairs at Huawei Tech in the US. She is the SVP of Public Affairs and responsible for setting and executing public relations, government relations strategies for Huawei USA. And as mentioned, in her spare time, she likes to climb to the top of redwoods to install guardians of the forest. So welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So I want to remind everyone watching, again, please submit your questions in the box below the video player as we go, and that will help us in the conversation. But Joy, we've got to go right to you with your tree climbing episode there. Tell us a little bit about that. Well, when was that? How high up were you? What was that experience like?
Well, thank you, Andrew. That was before the pandemic, actually. We were 200 feet above the ground. It was quite hard, actually, to pull myself up there. I think it took Topher about 5 minutes. It took me probably 20 to 30 minutes to pull myself up. It was hard.
So good for you. Not scared of heights, obviously. And tell us a little bit about what prompted Huawei to work with Rainforest Connection. To me, it just innately makes so much sense to utilize and recycle these the technology of these smartphones to use them for a broader purpose. And as he said, that can last forever, basically. So it sounds like a great match. Love to hear a little bit about how that came about and where it's going.
Huawei's mission is to build a fully connected world, to bring the benefits of technology to everyone, everywhere. Several years ago, we established the Tech for All program that makes long-term nonprofit investments to help build a sustainable world. Environmental protection is a major component of the Tech for All program. In 2014, Topher, set up the Rainforest Connection, and he has become one of our partners for the Tech for All program. He used upcycled Huawei phones to collect data about environmental sounds and listen for illegal logging in real time. Due to the challenges of managing this huge amount of data and optimizing algorithms, Rainforest Connection needed systematic technical support to upgrade their solutions. So Huawei teamed up with Rainforest Connection to develop a fully integrated intelligence system, including collection equipment, storage services, and intelligent analysis. Since then, Rainforest Connection has launched projects in 10 countries across 5 continents. Huawei and Rainforest Connection have helped to protect about 6,000 square kilometers of rainforest and 4 billion trees, equivalent to reducing CO2 emissions by 300 million tons.
That's fantastic. And it was really incredible to hear Topher's passion and how much information they're gathering and the expansive data that they're pulling together, which we're going to dig into in a second. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about other climate-focused AI efforts that Huawei is either undertaking or thinking about going forward. Corporate participation, as Senator Whitehouse just mentioned, is critical to making this effort successful.
Mm-hmm. In addition to monitoring illegal logging, we can also use technology to detect and protect endangered species like the spider monkey in Costa Rica. These rare monkeys play an important role in maintaining our ecosystem by spreading seeds throughout the Costa Rican rainforest. But to protect something, you first need to find it. Locating these spider monkeys in the vast rainforest is extremely difficult. Huawei helped Rainforest Connection to build an intelligent model that detects and analyzes their sounds. The model provides information about the monkey's whereabouts and emotional state, and helping us understand their living habits and conditions so that forest rangers and biologists can protect the endangered species better. In Ireland, we recently kicked off another project with Ocean Research and Conservation to use Huawei's AI technology to better understand how the movement and noise of ships affects whales, dolphins, and other marine wildlife. The project is using underwater microphones to record the calls from whales and other species. The goal is to create a marine wildlife detection and classification model that can help researchers better understand marine life distribution and behavior and how noise pollution impacts them. So this kind of valuable information will help shape conservation efforts and policy decisions for years to come.
That's great to hear, and sounds like really good efforts both on the flora and fauna front. That was a question that we had for the Danish environment minister earlier in the day. So great to hear on some of those activities that Huawei is undertaking. Janet, would love to bring you into the conversation and talk a little bit more about what WRI is doing. You're using AI and big data to reduce deforestation and monitor trees both inside and outside forests, and not just from a perspective of deforestation, but actual growth, which is an important and very difficult element to monitor. But would love to hear a little bit more about what WRI is doing.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew, and thanks for the opportunity here. So just sort of remind people that there's no way to get to any 1.5 degrees climate scenario without significant increases in land carbon sequestration and protecting the carbon that we have there. Just as a sort of indicator there, the soil, just the soil globally contains 3 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, and then forests about another 1 time. So it's really important. So we've been thinking about land as a strategic asset for society now, and we're kind of facing this land crunch, because there are many competing uses for land. We need to produce 45% more food, more timber for construction. So we've been looking at it in terms of 3 things. We need to protect the forests and the carbon that's tied up in those. We need to also restore, and we need to manage the working land more efficiently and effectively to take pressure off the protected areas. So I'll talk a little bit about how we're using data and IO in each of those 3 categories. So on the protect, one of our sort of working tools there has been something called the GLAD alert. The GLAD alert is something we developed with the University of Maryland, and we execute it with the Google Earth engine. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with the phones, but it uses satellite-based information. So we have once a week, every 30 meters, we're able to monitor across the whole tropics where deforestation is happening. And then we turn that into a mappable visualization, and we then serve it up to people that are in those areas that have signed up for these alerts. And we'll just put it up on the screen now, and you'll get a sort of sense of how that looks. So I don't know if we can see the visual. There you go. There it is. So this is the Cordillera National Park. So this should be actually logging in here, but you'll see this sort of pink snaking line in there. So those are actually deforestation alerts. It's actually a logging road. I don't know if you can see it. I can just about see it on my screen. But anyway, we produce these alerts for the whole tropics, and it's a service we provide, and we serve them out. So in Uganda, they're given to the U.S. Forest, the Ugandan Forest Service. They use them to prioritize where they put their limited boots on the campground. In Peru, we serve it up to indigenous organizations and those people representing them so they can protect their large territories. And in Madagascar, we're serving it up to NGOs. So that's the protect side. On the restore side, it's a little more difficult to use satellites to see forests. Like with intact forests, like primary forest, you have this very dense image, so you can see it with satellites. With restoring, when you're putting trees back, remember last year was a sort of it was really the year of restoration, all these trillion trees initiatives. There's another one launched last week at the Climate Summit, the LEAF initiative. That's a little more difficult. So unless you've got a lot of resources, you can pay for high resolution satellites, which we don't have, because everything we're doing is making open. We've had to develop a new methodology. So we use kind of computer vision there to actually recognize trees outside the forest. And actually, there are a lot of them in agroforestry that not being reported or monitored in national accounts. But we also want to be able to see trees restored. So we've developed a methodology that does that. It's actually turned out to be quite accurate. And this actually provides confidence now to investors that are investing in nature-based solutions that we can actually monitor the results. The third area I just wanted to mention is the manage. And this is kind of really the important frontier now, is okay, we can actually monitor forests. We're getting better at monitoring restoration. But we need to look at how we're using the working lands. Are we using it efficiently? Are we producing as much food as we can on every acre of land? Because as I said earlier, we need to produce 45% more. So if you're not using that land efficiently, you're going to spill over into the remaining natural ecosystems. And there are commercially available techniques now that allow you to almost see crops grown. You can actually predict productivity on an acre by acre level. but none of these methods are sort of in the public domain. So that's something we're working on with this sort of new land and carbon watch. Let me just sort of stop there and let you get in if you wish.
Sure. So that's actually really interesting insights, those three levels of analyzing, especially those last two, restore and manage. I wanted to turn to with you to energy for a second, and some of the tools that you have, Energy Access Explorer and Global Power Plant data sets, great tools for energy planning and understanding the impacts of climate change on industry and energy infrastructure. How can we share some of these insights that you're talking about in developed markets like the US? You've mentioned quite a few emerging and developing markets where we can help them conserve their resources, but you've got a lot of very well-developed resources in developed markets that are hard to move around and conserve. And I was wondering if that's something that you could talk about, if WRI focuses on that as well.
Yep, I'd love to do that. Just one little footnote to that. We have been experimenting now about how do we actually predict deforestation before it actually happens. So it's kind of like that Minority Report. You remember that film? They arrest people before they do the deed. So no, I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. But actually, we are able to do that now, looking at sort of spatial pattern changes historically. But over onto the energy side. So two tools I wanted to highlight. One is called one isn't really relevant to, to marketplaces like the US, and the other is, but let me start with the first one. The Energy Access Explorer is a tool that we developed for countries that don't have modern electricity serving a large part of the population. So countries like Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya. And what it does is it basically, again, is using AI and machine learning to identify areas where there is no modern electricity, you can sort of tell that, but also where there are signs that actually there are populations there, large populations, that have the ability to afford modern electricity if it was offered to them. So this is very useful information to entrepreneurs, renewable energy entrepreneurs, because they have the resources, they just don't know where to go spatially. So that's been a useful thing, and we're sharing that with other places. It's not really relevant to the US. Most people are lucky enough to have modern electricity here. The other initiative that is relevant is what we call the Global Power Plant data set. And even though the power sector contributes 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions, there was never sort of one central database for this. A lot of it's sort of tied up in commercial apps that aren't just sort of publicly available. So again, we used AI and machine learning to sort of collect data from a myriad of different sources on 300,000 power plants across the world. So we actually have mapped geospatially 80% of the global installed energy capacity across 146 countries, and actually made that data available. It's like you can actually see it on an open data platform. You can visualize it and overlay it with different information. It's called resourcewatch.org. But then we actually had data gaps in there that we didn't have energy generation information. We had capacity information, but not what these plants were generating. That's kind of like having a car and knowing how fast it could go, but not knowing how much it was actually driven. This is really important information. We're able to generate that information, add that. And one of the reasons why this is going to be useful for countries like the US is that we've now started to look at parameters like, well, what's the climate impacts on the ability of these power plants to generate energy? So something like hydro or thermal, which actually requires large amounts of water for cooling, are actually severely impacted when there's drought and reductions in precipitation. So again, using historical information that we have on generation outages and the weather patterns, we're able to predict where we're going to sort of see power outages. And we've kind of seen some of that in Texas quite recently for other reasons. This is a very useful tool. Of course, it's an indicator, it's a prediction, it's not actually, but it actually allows, regulators and investors to think about where there may be risks that they need to intervene in. So that's maybe an example of a use in this country.
Excellent. That's really good insight, and good to hear those different data sets and the applications they might have. I'm very keen to get Abby involved in this conversation. I've seen her nodding throughout the discussion. And Abby, it'd be great to talk a little bit about actually how we use this data. And you might want to take a second, if I could ask you to explain exactly what Blue Sky does. You talk about the appification of environmental data. What does that mean exactly? How does Blue Sky deploy that? And we'd love to get into the discussion of some of the applications.
Awesome. Great to be here, Andrew. And I think all the panelists are saying such exact things. So I feel within the realm of environment and climate data, we are in the world of 1980s or 1985 internet. Back in 1985, early 90s, what all were the developments that were happening in the realm of internet? Those are some of the developments that are happening within climate technologies right now. So for instance, the major role for us at Blue Sky Analytics is a lot of research and a lot of data analytics and a lot of models have been built over the past 20, 25 years by climate scientists all over the world. However, they're not as easily accessible to everybody. And that's sort of stopping or putting hindrances on the downstream use cases. It's not in the hands of multiple developers and data scientists and different companies out there. And that the discovery process of finding the right data set, finding the right model, finding the right application, it requires time and effort, which I would say now that as we're heading into 2021 and going into this pathway of 55 billion tons of carbon emissions per year, trying to dodge the bullet of 1.5 degrees Celsius of heating, we need to go faster and bigger. And that's where I think the recent developments that have happened in cloud or in just building API gateways, the engineering technologies that we witnessed in the last 5 years, just the computational superpower that we as a planet now have. With Blue Sky, we want to deploy all of that computational superpower to be able to analyze huge volumes of data sets using, in many cases, models that have already existed. And then productize all of it to kind of provide to you in a off-the-shelf manner. So instead of having to go to a baker to have them make a very custom pastry, you could come to a shop and just order a pastry right then and there.
Very interesting. And tell us a little bit about how old Blue Sky is, a little bit about, you're not just obtaining satellite data, a little bit about what kind of activity you've seen. And then maybe you could pivot into where you're sourcing that data from, what some of those reservoirs are that you're calling on, because we'd like to talk a little bit about the importance of open data.
Yeah. So you were just talking to Rainforest Alliance, and I was just like, oh my God, these guys are sitting on one of the best data mines ever. And if we were able to take some of those data sets and match it with the kind of data sets that we have, that's going to be just amazing models. You can increase accuracies and resolutions manifold. And that was, just sitting right here. I was like, joining the dots. So the kind of data sets that we have is both public and private satellite data providers. So we were probably across the spectrum with more than 10, 15 organizations. We as a company are super young. We're just 2 years old. 2 years ago, we were only 4 kids sitting on a dining table in India. So we have grown a lot. Now we are 25 people sitting across, working across the globe. We call ourselves COVID baby. So we are a completely remote company. We do not have any office or anything and don't plan to have one. And I would say in many ways, we are shaping how technologies or companies or AI applications of this decade would look like. For us, it's very primarily focused on environmental and climate data sets, to be able to put them all in a manner which is extremely accessible for people. We like to call it sort of Bloomberg for environmental data, so that, it's kind of like a collaboration with WRIs of the world, with lots of research universities in the world, and just trying to bring it all in the hands of the consumer, so that one of the applications that we saw last year was that somebody built an Instagram filter out of our air pollution data set. And it's like a silly application, but you see a lot of use cases. You see a lot of mindset changing when there's an Instagram filter of smog in India. So those are some of the fun applications, but there are also many more deeper applications in risk modeling, in energy investments, in ESG investments, in making net zero apps and things like that.
Excellent. And I love your description, your a growth story as a COVID baby by necessity coming together across the world as a startup and successfully doing that That's really heartening to hear after everything we've been through this year and the crisis that we're in right now and trying to resolve. So thank you for that thought. I want to remind our audience to ask questions of the participants that we've got here. They're ready to take your questions. We've got one right now, actually. This is for you, Janet. It's from Alex Krauka. He's with the U.S. Energy Association in Seattle. And it kind of references what Abby was just talking about giving access to some of this data. The question is, has anyone used energy access application for Native American First Nation reservations that may not necessarily have the same energy infrastructure as the general population here in the US? A very specific question for you, Janet. Is that one that you have any knowledge of, whether the indigenous US Native American reservations and nations have used some of your data?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know whether they have used the data, but the Energy Access Explorer tool could potentially be used for that. I mean, it wasn't just developed for those 3 countries I mentioned. In fact, it's being used in India as well now. So something that would be interesting to follow up on. It'd also be good, like the power plant data set, which I think I said 300,000, there's actually 30,000 plants in it. What we've been trying to do is go down and down, to start to have more of the lower capacity renewables on there too. But again, it would be good to see what reservations have. Those could be mapped on there too, because we start to highlight some of the energy access equity issues, even in this country.
Great. And another question for you, Janet, and this is from me rather than one of our audience. Wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of open data. Why is that an important feature and element of what, rather than proprietary, of what we're using to create AI? What's WRI's view and commitment on that? And I know there's elements around trust that need to be thought of here, and I'd love to hear Abby's thoughts on this as well after you give us yours. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of open data.
Yeah, so for WRI, it's a blood and lifeline for most of all of our work in this space. WRI itself has made an open data commitment. We're open science, open data, open code. But all of the satellite stuff, information we've been using is because it's made freely available either by the US government or the European Space Agency. And in fact, about 4 years ago, there was a little scare amongst us that maybe the US government was going to, close down some of that satellite information and start to charge, which would have been the sort of death knell. So I'm a big fan of open data, where it should be open, where there's a public good benefit of that, whether it's from universities, research agencies, the government, while also respecting that certain information has privacy concerns around it, but that has to also be balanced against the sort of public good. So we need to protect privacy, but also be encouraging these public good uses. That's information is power. A lot of commercial companies have this information. We want to get the same information into the public to drive better decision making and hold those responsible for making decisions accountable.
That's great. And Abby, I know you have some thoughts on this as well. It's really critical that we do join with private sources of data and democratize access to data and intelligence. Would love to get your views on that.
Definitely. So I think it's Janet actually pointed out on that for some cases, privacy of the data matters. So our view is we are also enabled in many ways by public data, but by adding a layer of privacy, or what we call like a freemium kind of model, we are able to offer much higher resolutions. So when you go down to more, 1 kilometer square, 500 meters square, 250 meters square, that's a range where the data could not be completely public, because we are talking about data like the tiles which are covering your house. And you wouldn't want some of that information in a completely public domain. So that's where sort of a freemium model comes in. We as a company have a rate structure, a price structure, which is like you have a free tier which is for students and researchers and media personnel across the world, wherein you can extract certain volume of data at certain resolution. But as you start to go into higher volumes, for instance, you want to do 3 million API hits, that should not be free. And that money could be then used by a company like us to be able to build much more models and deploy many more people in this, many more engineers doing climate work. There's a very fun quote, I would say, which is, I'm forgetting the person who attributed it. It is such a sad thing that the greatest minds for a generation are busy sort of selling data, selling ads. That's where most of the data and most of the engineering minds of our generation are being allocated for. And by doing this sort of private structure, we are bringing that mind back to environment and climate, wherein there is a freemium model, which allows for the same level of public good, in many cases, more public good, as Janet was mentioning, but then you have a paid and an enterprise version. For instance, let's say Huawei wants to access a lot of environmental data, and they are going to make 10 million API hits a year. They are definitely a company which can afford to pay for that money, and that would allow us to build better models, get better data, procure from folks like Rainforest Alliance, and just build a much more richer repository that we need for future.
Oh, very interesting. And I can tell you, as a publisher of Foreign Policy, a media company, I definitely can relate to the brain power and analysis and AI that goes into advertising technology, and how we should train some of those guns on causes like climate. I think would really create some real value. And so thank you for those comments. Joy, I would love to come back to you and talk a little bit about other applications for AI in the environment, and specifically about agriculture. Agriculture is a sector ripe for AI disruption. Farmers are optimizing crop yields. They can also, though, AI can help detect diseases in animals. And I know that was deployed in 2019 during the swine flu epidemic. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Huawei's involvement and thinking about how we can deploy AI to improve agriculture.
Sure, Andrew, you're absolutely right. Traditionally, agriculture industry is quite analog and is a little bit behind other industries in terms of digitization. But with the help of 5G, cloud, and AI, the industry is on the cusp of a major transformation. There are quite a few great solutions that are helping farmers around the world. In the 2019 swine flu epidemic, AI was used to identify the pigs that were infected with virus. Huawei was not necessarily involved in that process, but in general, the swine flu caused pigs to have fever, higher heartbeat, and coughs. So cameras and voice recognition can identify pigs with symptoms and isolate them and prevent further infection. Of course, it is hard to predict the outbreak because we don't have sufficient historical data to build model yet, but early detection is very important as well. Other than disease detection, farmers are now using AI to increase milk production of cows. In Switzerland, there are a lot of these connected cows. Each cow has a neck collar that has a sensor for body temperature and other parameters, so that farmers know if their cows are in good health or not at all times. There's also a nose holster that can sense pressure. So every time the cow chews the feed, it sends a signal to the sensor. All the information is sent to the cloud and analyzed with AI, so farmers can see the feeding and rumination frequencies of the cows with smartphones. We know when cows eat more feed, they produce more milk. On average, a cow produces about 8 gallons of milk each day, and about 20,000 gallons through the milk producing years, which is 5 to 7 years on average. With all these technologies, we can increase the daily milk production for each cow, and we can also extend the span of milk producing years to more than 10 years and even longer. Switzerland now has cows producing 55,000 gallons milk throughout lifespan, which is 2.5 times more than the average cow. In addition to these connected cows, there are also connected trees. So basically, you put a ring with a sensor around the tree stem. The diameter of the tree stem changes between day and night. During the day, because of transpiration, the diameter decreases. At night, with water, the diameter of the tree stem increases. The data are sent to the cloud for analysis. Farmers can understand if the trees are thirsty or not, and when to water these trees. So just by doing this, farmers can save 30% of water while increasing the yields of the trees. So technology these days can really help us increase efficiency for farming while preserving our natural resources and our environment.
That's really interesting. Connected cows. Joy, we're going to have to invite you back for a discussion around that very topic when we have our food summit at the end of the year, the FP Food Summit. That'll be a very, very fascinating discussion. This has really been interesting. I'm afraid that we're out of time, but I've really appreciated this great discussion. It's really fascinating to learn about all these advances in tech and how they can make such a huge impact on our environment. So I want to thank you, Joy and Abby and Janet, for joining us today. It was really, really good.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Great. We're also going to hear more about this topic tomorrow as we explore the role of critical resources such as tech metals and other raw materials that are crucial to drive the green industrial revolution and our ability to manufacture clean energy technologies. So please do come back tomorrow to hear more about that if you're interested in the technologies around battling climate. I'd now like to take us across from the rainforests of South America to the other part of the global south, over to one of the countries most exposed to the climate crisis, Bangladesh. We'd like to share a special message from Sheikh Hasina. She's Prime Minister of Bangladesh, and she prepared this message especially for the FP Climate Summit. Bangladesh is on the forefront of the climate crisis. It's having experienced record flooding in the past year. And sadly, many developing nations are most impacted by climate change, and they contribute very little to greenhouse gas emissions, like Bangladesh. In fact, the G20 countries are responsible for about 80% of total global emissions, while the bottom 100 countries only account for 3.5%. Sheikh Hasina is chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, a group of 48 countries disproportionately affected by a warming planet, Bangladesh among them. CVF nations have been at the forefront of climate adaptation as well as climate change. And we're going to hear a little bit about that from Sheikh Hasina right now. So please do stay tuned and let's listen to Sheikh Hasina.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to you all. I'm greatly honored to be invited at the Foreign Policy Virtual Climate Summit. I would like to thank the organizers and the audiences. The entire world is passing through a tough time with COVID-19 pandemic, claiming a large number of lives and infecting hundreds of thousands more every day. We need united efforts to get rid of the deadly virus. After COVID-19, the most discussed subject of the time, perhaps, it is the climate change. Climate change has now become a huge threat for every country, especially for the climate vulnerable countries like Bangladesh. The global temperature is rising, there is no doubt about it. And this temperature rise is the main culprit of all ills. The continuous rise of global temperature is the most pressing concern for the humankind. In the Paris Climate Accord, we have agreed not to allow the global temperature to rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius. But nothing substantial has so far been done to check the emission of greenhouse gases which are responsible for the temperature rise. Countries like Bangladesh have been experiencing increased frequencies and foresights of various climate-induced extreme weather events like flooding, droughts, tidal surge, northwester, heavy rainfall, etc. As I am delivering this message, a heat wave is sweeping over my country. Last year, we experienced heavy monsoon that submerged one-third of my country. Several cyclones, including supercyclone Amphan, also hit my country last year. All these phenomena are due to climate change. Bangladesh is not an emitter. In fact, no member country of Climate Vulnerable Forum is significant emitter. But we are the worst sufferers. Every year, 2% of my country's GDP is lost to extreme climate events. The 1.1 million forcibly evicted Rohingyas from Myanmar, we have given shelter in the environmentally critical Cox's Bazar district, heavily affected the ecology of the area. The bottom 100 countries in terms of GDP account for just 3.5% of the global emission, whereas the G20 countries are responsible for 80%. Despite resources constraints, CBF countries are at the forefront of climate adaptation. Bangladesh is the first LDC country to establish a climate change fund. So far, we spent over $415 million from our own resources to implement over 800 mitigation and adaptation programs. We appreciate US President Joe Biden's decision and also holding of the Leaders Summit last week. The Paris Agreement, the international community has pledged $100 billion in climate finance each year for adaptation and mitigation purposes. We have to ensure effective delivery of the fund to reach climate vulnerable communities and economies. Strict implementation of the Paris Agreement is the only way to check global emission and thereby global warming. I hope all of you will agree with me. I thank you all.
And we thank you, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina from Bangladesh, for providing us with that update on climate mitigation goals in Bangladesh and your view on what the Biden administration is doing. And we appreciate your participation. I'd now like to introduce another member of the foreign policy team, Susan Sadagova, a colleague of mine who's Vice President of Strategic Development at FP. Susan is the driving force behind the creation of this inaugural climate summit. And she is going to introduce us to a very important guest to close out the first day of our program. And I think we're all excited to hear, especially in light of the recent personal tragedy in his family, how his focus on mitigating the impacts of climate change is unwavering. Welcome, Susan, and do tell us who you are ready to introduce.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that warm introduction. It's been really a pleasure working on this event. And yes, indeed, it is my special honor to introduce our last keynote speaker of the day, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. You may all know already that His Royal Highness has been a long-time champion for the climate and for sustainability. He's launched several initiatives such as Terra Carta and Sustainable Markets Initiative that provide a roadmap and incentives to the private sector to transition to a more sustainable future. And these initiatives are so incredibly important and urgent, and we're so grateful. Excuse me, we're so grateful that His Royal Highness is able to share them with our audience today. And with that, without further delay, let's now hear from His Royal Highness.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm enormously touched to have been invited to join you all today for this Foreign Policy Virtual Climate Summit as you look to identify practical actions to address the urgent health, climate and biodiversity crises posed by global warming and by our destruction of biodiversity. When all is said and done, I'm afraid that the COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated with great, if grim, clarity that human health, economic health, and planetary health are fundamentally interconnected. Having tried for the past 40 years or so to raise awareness of the urgent need to tackle these threat-multiplying issues, and as we look towards recovery from this terrible pandemic, all I have learnt and observed tells me that we have only a dangerously narrow window of opportunity to determine the future we wish to build and indeed leave for future generations to come. You have heard today from experts far more competent than I am in how best to accelerate and mainstream sustainability into every aspect of our economy. Before making what I hope are 3 practical suggestions of my own, I would just like to invite you to consider what seems to me a vital principle. That is, to put nature at the center of our entire economy. In other words, a circular bioeconomy. To those brought up to consider nature as some kind of inanimate mechanical process, this may seem an overly romantic idea. But let us consider the facts. For nearly every problem we face, nature, with the benefit of billions of years of evolution, has already provided us with solutions that are right in front of our eyes. Universal principles rooted in the harmony of nature's patterns, cycles, and geometry, which ancient civilizations and indigenous peoples have known all too well, need to be harnessed ever more rigorously to inform science, technology, design, and engineering, and can, in fact, drive a sustainable future. Take the growing potential and application of renewable energy, be it solar, wind, or green hydrogen, that is now transforming almost every industry. Furthermore, nature teaches us that we must value diversity and interdependence, as diversity is a strength that not only gives resilience to the natural world, but also to communities, systems, and organizations. We only have to look at the critical importance of diversity in forest restoration and regenerative agriculture to realize that we simply cannot have genuinely sustainable forests and food systems by continuing to rely on outdated and damaging industrialized monocultures. To help move the global economic transition forward, there must be a center of gravity to catalyze such a monumental effort and to mobilize the resources and incentives required. Today's event brings together eminent formulators and implementers of foreign policy from around the world. After spending, as I said, some 40 years or more trying to mobilize the private sector, I have long been convinced that the public sector on its own cannot possibly achieve the results we need. The private sector will have to help identify and shift barriers, help innovate, and of course, help produce the finance required to alter course rapidly onto a more sustainable path. In order to try and encourage the private sector to see that it holds the key to the solutions we so urgently need, I set up my Sustainable Markets Initiative in January 2020 to bring together leaders from industries in almost every sector, from aviation to plastics, with the express aim of identifying obstacles to progress and ways in which roadblocks can be shifted. With these insights, in January this year, I launched the Terra Carta, as the basis of a recovery plan for nature, people, and planet. At this historic tipping point, with the lives and livelihoods of present and future generations in mind, the Terra Carta offers 10 short articles for action, a roadmap, if you like, for acceleration towards an ambitious and genuinely sustainable future without greenwash, one that harnesses the power of nature combined with the transformative capability, innovation, and resources of the private sector. This project, or charter, is building steady support from companies to civic authorities, with, for instance, the City of Athens joining only a couple of weeks ago. To accelerate, we need to adopt a future of industry and future of economy approach. A green recovery, together with green stimulus and green jobs, offers a tremendous opportunity to reset the economy and provide relief to the millions of people around the world who have faced such economic hardships in this pandemic. In our global transition efforts, I believe profoundly that we must also focus on the local traditions, languages, and cultures, along with local products, jobs, and sustainability, as it is how these locals connect and support each other in the wider tapestry of regional and global systems that will ensure our efforts are sustained in the long term. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I promised 3 practical suggestions, which I hope you might bear in mind as we all look towards COP26 and still further ahead to 2030. First of all, scale. It seems to me that we need an ever-increasing global coalition of like-minded actors. In this, I hope my Terra Carta might help frame thinking and conversations with a view to countries, cities, businesses, and consumers publicly communicating their roadmaps and the actions they are taking to accelerate progress along the sustainable trajectory. Simply knowing each other's priorities is, I think, half the battle, so we can start joining the dots and leapfrogging for acceleration. Secondly, breadth. To move further faster, we need transition alliances that include industry, investment, and country efforts. Through the Terra Carta and the institutional investors that have joined our efforts and the over $60 trillion they represent, we are working to build 10 transition alliances for the decade, which will accelerate our collective efforts in a manner that is coherent and creates a force multiplier. Thirdly, and inevitably, money. With increasing amounts of capital seeking sustainable investment opportunities, we are working to help develop a pipeline of investable and truly sustainable projects at sufficient scale. As the over $60 trillion represented by my Sustainable Markets Initiative's institutional investors community highlights, funds are available and now, at last, and rather late in the day, seeking sustainable investments. We need to redouble efforts to connect them to viable projects which meet best practice in sustainability. With the support of the Big Four accountancy firms, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, and Deloitte, and our own financial structures, we are developing a blueprint to unlock the investment to investables pipeline starting in the Commonwealth. With a target of June, ahead of the G7 summit, I've had the great pleasure of talking to Commonwealth presidents and prime ministers, discussing their transition priorities so that the supply of sustainable investment projects for the decade can be rapidly increased. It is my greatest hope that these efforts will benefit all countries seeking sustainable investment to accelerate their transition. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we can do this. We must do this. Indeed, a sustainable future is in fact the growth story of our time. But it is up to us to seize this fleeting opportunity before it really is too late. With the clock ticking and COP26 only a heartbeat away, let us therefore join forces and make each day count.
Well, thank you so much. That was, we just heard from His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. Thanks again to His Royal Highness for sharing this message with us. I do encourage everyone to check out Sustainable Markets Initiative and what it means for the private sector. Well, that's it for day one of our inaugural climate summit. We're really thrilled and excited to have been able to bring together such a distinguished group of speakers and global thinkers. And we're really inspired by the renewed ambitions propelling forward tangible progress on the global climate challenge. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to our wonderful audience. And of course, thank you to our partners for supporting this important program today. The government of Japan, the European Union, the Nuclear Energy Institute, Chevron, RBC Capital Markets, TechMed, and BHP. Please be sure to tune in tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. We have an exciting day 2 of programming planned. We're going to hear from the President of Colombia, from Prime Minister of Iceland. We'll hear from the members of Senate and Congress, as well as we'll explore specific approaches to empowering the transition to clean energy and what's needed from the private sector. With that, we'll look forward to reconnecting tomorrow. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.